Chapter 1. The Black Coach Rides Again. The Silence After the Slaughter. The village of Dunkelwald had always been quiet, a nameless speck on the outskirts of Sturland, where the trees grew twisted and the mist clung to the ground like a living thing. It had never been a place of importance, just another cluster of huts and thatched-roof cottages where simple folk lived, farmed, and died in obscurity. But tonight Dunkelwald was silent in a way it had never been before. Not the silence of a sleeping village, nor the hushed reverence of prayer, but something far worse. A silence that lingered, thick and unnatural, heavy with the weight of something forgotten returning to the world. The mist had come first. It rolled in just before sunset, thick and black-veined, swallowing the fields, the trees, even the distant hills beyond. It had slithered between doorframes, coiled in the eaves of houses, crept beneath beds and through the narrow slats of barns. And then, when the last light of day had faded, the screaming began. No one heard them now. No one was left to scream. The streets of Dunkelwald were painted in moonlight and death. Pale corpses lay where they had fallen, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror, eyes glassy and open, mouths locked in silent screams. Not a drop of blood remained within them. It had been ripped from their veins, leaving their flesh waxy cold and brittle. Houses stood open and empty, doors creaking in the gentle night wind. Livestock lay in their pens, untouched but staring with eyes that no longer saw. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints in the damp earth. Only the darkened road leading out of the village and the blackened trails burned into the dirt like scars. The marks of wheels, too deep for any mortal carriage, too unnatural in shape, hoofprints cloven and split, burned black against the ground. A road paved in sorrow and shadow. The road the black coach had taken, the thing that rides at night. No one had seen it clearly. Not the faint-hearted who had slammed their doors and hidden beneath their tables, nor the foolish ones who had tried to run. Not even the old woman, the midwife who had lived longer than any of them, who had whispered of the days when Sylvania's horrors were kept at bay only by fire and faith. Yet all had felt it. A shape against the mist. A twisted silhouette, impossibly tall and narrow, its frame rotted and splintered from age, yet somehow still strong enough to move forward. A black coach, its wheels turning without driver or reins. Its steeds skeletal things with burning eyes, their breath curling in unnatural vapor. The stench of grave dirt and centuries-old rot, suffocating and thick, drowning the village in a horror they could not fight. And within the coach something moved. A shadow deeper than night itself, shifting. It did not hurry. It did not charge through the village like a raiding warband. It drifted. It glided, like a funeral procession, slow and inevitable, knowing that there was no need to rush, for all things would come to it in time. The last to see it had been the boy, a scrawny, half-starved child, the son of a farmer who had tried to wake his parents when the mist had come. He had seen the coach emerge from the blackness, its shape too large, too wrong to be real. He had seen the door open. He had seen what lay inside. And when they found him the next morning, his mind was gone. His body still breathing but drained, his skin cold as a corpse. His mouth locked in an endless, soundless scream. The forgotten prince stirs. Somewhere beyond Dunkelwald, deeper into Stirland's forgotten roads, the black coach rolled onward. Its path was not random. It was drawn to places of death, to the places where the veil between this world and the next was weakest. And within its shadowed interior, something stirred. Not alive. Not truly dead. Something in between. A prince without a kingdom. A king without a throne. A revenant waiting to be reborn. Valerius Von Carstein. He did not sit upon silk cushions, nor was he adorned in regal finery. His body, tattered and ruined, was wrapped in the remnants of noble garments, rotted lace and torn crimson velvet, his pale flesh marred with the scars of his cursed fate. His hands, clawed and skeletal, rested upon his lap, his fingers twitching with unnatural life. His throat, once strong and noble, bore the faint, lingering marks of his last mortal moments, a wound long healed but never forgotten. He did not breathe. He did not blink, but his eyes burned, glowing faintly in the pitch-dark hollow of the coach. Wait, he was not yet whole, not yet strong enough to walk the world as he once had, not yet ready to reclaim what was his. But he would be. Each place of death they passed fed him, each stolen soul strengthened him. Every whispered prayer to gods who would not answer brought him closer. And soon, when the time was right, he would rise again, not as the scattered shade of a fallen prince, not as a whispered nightmare in the dark, but as a king, a ruler of the night once more, and the world would tremble beneath his shadow. Dawn rises, but the night remains. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the world in hues of pale gold and soft blue, the ruins of Dunkelwald lay still. The dead did not rise, nor did the village burn, but the fear lingered, and far, far away, in the distance, beyond the mist-laden roads and the forests too dark to hold life, the faint sound of wheels against the earth carried on the wind. A warning, the black coach rides again, and it will not stop. Chapter 2. A Knight's Oath. The Road to Stirland. The road was long and unkind, stretching from the emerald fields of Bretonnia into the ashen-gray countryside of the Empire, where the trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers into the fog-heavy sky. The land of Stirland was old, worn by centuries of war and strife, where the bones of the dead rested uneasily beneath the surface and whispers of dark things rode the wind. Julien de Calmont rode alone, his destrier Beaufort carrying him with a measured, cautious gait. The beast's powerful muscles twitched beneath its barding, its nostrils flaring with unease. The knight could feel it too, the unnatural chill in the air, the way the sun seemed dimmer here, as though reluctant to shine upon this forsaken land. He had heard the stories. Villages left in silence, the people found pale and drained, their bodies cold as grave soil. They called it the Black Coach, a rotting hearse pulled by dead horses, gliding through the night, carrying something terrible within. The whispers reached Bretonnia weeks ago, and Julien had ridden north without hesitation. He was a questing knight, sworn to the Lady of the Lake, seeking the Grail and proving his worthiness through deeds of honor and battle. And if this was the evil he was meant to vanquish, he would meet it head-on. The dying priest. Julien reached the village of Eltberg just as the storm rolled in, the sky turning the color of bruised flesh, thunder groaning in the distance. The village reeked of incense and burnt herbs, desperate attempts to ward off the evil they could not see. The streets were empty, save for a few frightened faces peering from shuttered windows, their expressions hollow with dread. The tavern was silent, the market abandoned. Only the chapel of Moor still had voices within. Julien dismounted, guiding Beaufort to a post before stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of blood and death. At the center of the small stone chapel, upon the cold flagstone floor, lay an elderly priest, his robes soaked through with crimson, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. A younger cleric knelt beside him, whispering desperate prayers to Moor, the god of the dead, his voice breaking with sorrow. The dying priest opened his clouded eyes as Julien approached. His breath rattled in his throat, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to grasp something unseen. "You have come." Julien knelt beside him, setting his gauntleted hand upon the priest's trembling shoulder. I am Sir Julien de Calmont, questing Knight of Bretonia. What has happened here?" The priest's lips trembled, his milky eyes staring past Julien, as if seeing something beyond mortal sight. "It rides again." A chill ran through Julien's spine. "The black coach?" The priest coughed, a wet, gurgling sound, his body convulsing as blood dripped from his lips. "The forgotten prince shall ride, and should none stop him." His fingers grasped Julien's cloak, pulling him closer with surprising strength. "The living will kneel before a king of the dead. Once more. A promise in blood." The chapel was silent, save for the crackling of burning candles. Julien felt the weight of the words, the prophecy spoken in the final moments of a dying servant of More. The forgotten prince, a king of the dead. He did not know the name, but he knew the truth within those words. Something had returned, something terrible, and it would not stop unless forced back into the grave. Julien clenched his fists. This was why he had come. This was his purpose. Rising to his full height, he drew his long sword, the blade gleaming in the dim candlelight. "I swear," he said, his voice ringing through the chapel, "by the Lady of the Lake, by the honor of my house, and by the blade of my ancestors, I will stop this horror." He raised the sword above the dying priest, letting its silvered edge catch the flickering light. "The forgotten prince shall not rise again." The priest exhaled one final breath. The light in his eyes dimmed. The cleric beside him wept, his hands trembling as he placed them over the priest's lifeless chest. Julien lowered his sword and whispered a quiet prayer. The road ahead. That night, Julien did not sleep. He stood outside the chapel, watching the darkened road, waiting, listening. The storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy with blackened clouds. The air was thick, clinging to his skin like a shroud. Somewhere in the distance, deep within the endless cursed roads of Stirland, he swore he heard it. The distant rhythmic sound of wheels turning upon the earth. The faint, echoing clatter of skeletal hooves upon stone. A whisper that was not a voice but a presence, an unholy thing stirring in the dark. The black coach rode again, and it would not stop, but neither would he. Julien de Calmont mounted Beaufort, his armor gleaming in the ghostly moonlight, his sword ready at his side. He pulled his cloak tightly about his shoulders and spurred his steed forward, following the cursed path into the unknown. A knight's oath had been made, and there was no turning back. Chapter 3. The Ruins of Wurtbad. The Dead City. The road to Wurtbad was broken and abandoned, its cobblestones split by the encroaching roots of dead trees. The old Stirland capital had once been a place of trade and prosperity, but that was before the wars. Before Sylvania's shadow stretched beyond its cursed borders. Now it was a corpse of a city, the bones of its former greatness crumbling beneath the weight of time and ruin. Julien rode cautiously, his sword hand resting near the hilt of the sword of Calmont, his hazel eyes scanning the ruins ahead. Beaufort snorted uneasily beneath him, his hooves clattering against stones stained by centuries of bloodshed. The battle had happened long ago, but its echoes still lingered. Once, the armies of the Empire had marched here, seeking to drive out the vampiric taint of Sylvania. Once, the soldiers of Stirland had died screaming beneath blackened banners, impaled upon spears wielded by things that did not breathe. Now only silence remained. And yet there was something else, a weight in the air, a presence, something that waited. The black coach had come here for a reason. The battlefield of shadows. Julien rode through the ruins, passing collapsed towers and shattered gates, following the deep burned tracks in the earth, the marks of the black coach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world grew still. The ruins, already long abandoned, felt even more desolate, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Belfort stopped abruptly, refusing to move forward. His ears twitched, his muscles tense beneath his barding. Something was coming. Julien dismounted, gripping his sword. He could feel it now, the air growing thick, the temperature dropping. The ruins trembled. From the mist the black coach emerged. It was rotted and ruined, its frame held together by age, back-and iron, its wheels spinning without sound. The horses pulling it were not horses at all, but skeletons wrapped in necrotic flesh, their eyes glowing with bale fire, their mouths twisted into silent screams. The air pulsed with ancient agony. As the coach slowed, its doors creaked open, and something inside stirred. The dead rise. A low moan rippled through the battlefield. Then a second. Then 100. The dead answered the call. From beneath the ruined earth, skeletal hands clawed their way to the surface. From the shattered armor of fallen men, blackened bones began to stir. From the piles of forgotten corpses, the knights, the footmen, the banners of the Stirland army, long decayed, rose once more. Undead soldiers, bound to their prince, bound to his war. They did not scream. They did not cry out. They simply stood, their hollow sockets locked onto the black coach, awaiting the will of the master within. And as the mist swirled, a voice echoed from the shadows. I remember this place. It was a whisper, but it carried through the battlefield like thunder. Julien tightened his grip on his sword, his breath steady despite the terror rising in his chest. Valerius was here. Not fully reborn, not yet among the living, but his will remained. His spirit was awakening, and he had seen Julien. A battle against the forgotten. The first undead lunged. Julien dodged, his sword flashing in the darkness, cleaving through a skeletal soldier, shattering its brittle bones. But as it fell, another rose in its place. They were endless. A dozen advanced, then 24, their rusted swords swinging, their armor clanking in hollow mockery of life. Julien fought like a man possessed, his blades striking with righteous fury, but he knew this was no mortal battle. They did not feel pain. They did not tire, and they would not stop. As he cut through another undead knight, he saw the black coach begin to shimmer, as though feeding upon the death around it. It was taking their suffering, their pain, their agony, and giving it to Valerius, the specter of the forgotten prince. Julien turned toward the coach, determination burning in his chest. If he could stop it now, sever its connection to the battlefield, then Valerius's return might yet be prevented. He charged. His boots thundered against the ruined earth, his cloak billowing behind him, his sword raised high. Then a shadow moved. A presence emerged. The air turned to ice. From the coach's open door something stepped forward. Tall, cloaked, a figure wrapped in shadow and ruin. Valerius Von Carstein. Not fully formed, not yet flesh, but his spectral remains, his will made manifest. His eyes, burning with crimson hunger, locked onto Julien. A knight, the voice was soft, almost amused. Still clinging to your foolish faith. Julien swung his sword. The blade passed through empty air. Valerius did not laugh, nor did he strike back. He only stared. You are too late. The battlefield erupted. The undead charged, a wave of rotting warriors, and Julien knew he could not stand against them all. He had to retreat. With a final glance at the coach, at the dark thing growing stronger within, he turned and fled into the ruins, the sound of clanking armor and marching dead pursuing him. The black coach did not follow. It did not need to. Its master had already won this battle. Valerius was growing stronger, and the night had only just begun. Julien's resolve. By the time he reached the edge of the ruins, the undead had returned to the ground, their purpose fulfilled. Julien turned back once more, staring at the battlefield where he had failed. The black coat was gone, but it would return. And next time, Valerius would be even closer to resurrection. Julien clenched his fist, swearing to himself that he would not fail again. The hunt was far from over. The forgotten prince would not rise. Not while Julien still drew breath. Chapter 4. Duel with the Dead. The unquiet night. The ruins of Wurtbad lay behind him, yet the stench of undeath still clung to the air, a sickly miasma of rot and old blood. Julien de Calmont pressed forward through the decayed road, his armor slick with the remnants of bone dust and ichor. The ghostly wails of the Stirland dead still echoing in his ears. He had survived the night's onslaught, but the battle had not been a victory. The black coach had vanished into the night, stronger than before. And somewhere, Valerius Von Carstein's soul was growing whole once more. Julien clenched his sword hilt tighter, his breath steady despite his exhaustion. Every time he thought he had made progress, the horror of it deepened. This was not a simple hunt for a monster. This was a race against the inevitable. And if he failed, Valerius would return in full. And the world would kneel beneath the king of the dead. The road of sorrow. Julien rode Beaufort down the winding, broken road, his keen nightly senses aware that something was wrong. The further he traveled, the colder the night became. The air grew dense, not just with the usual autumn chill, but with a creeping, deathly presence. Something was waiting, watching. He had seen these signs before. He was being hunted. The thought did not frighten him. It only steeled his resolve. He reined in Beaufort, stopping atop a hill that overlooked the blackened plains. There, in the faint moonlight, he saw what waited for him. A lone figure, standing motionless upon the ruined road. It was tall, clad in corroded plate armor, its once gleaming steel eaten away by rust and time. The tabard upon its chest had long since faded, but Julien recognized the shape of a sigil, torn and broken, the mark of the Von Carsteins. A knight, a champion of Valerius, or what remained of one. The thing did not move, yet Julien could feel its gaze upon him, empty sockets locked onto him, hollow and soulless, yet still clinging to duty. A wraith knight, a warrior who had not laid down his sword, even in death. A cursed soul, bound to serve the forgotten prince. Julien exhaled slowly, his muscles tightening, preparing for battle. He did not need to speak. Neither did the wraith knight. They both knew why they were here. One of them would not leave this road alive. Or, in the knight's case, not leave it at all. The duel begins. The wraith knight moved first, its form blurring with unnatural speed, its blade flashing silver beneath the moon. Julien barely parried in time. The force of the blow sent shockwaves up his arm, his bones rattling beneath his armor. The knight's strength was not of the living, it was something else, something fueled by vengeance and undeath. The impact nearly shattered his guard. Julien pushed back, shifting into an aggressive stance, his blade darting forward in a swift counterattack. His sword bit deep into the wraith knight's shoulder, but there was no blood. Only cold. The knight did not flinch, did not falter. It swung again, and this time Julien was not fast enough. The undead blade tore across his side, slicing through chainmail. Julien gritted his teeth, feeling the sting of steel against flesh, but he did not let the pain slow him. He spun, bringing his blade in a deadly arc, aiming for the knight's helm. The strike connected. The knight's helm split apart, revealing the horror beneath. There was no skull, no rotting flesh, only darkness, a swirling void of malice and lost souls, screaming within the empty armor. The wraith knight was no longer a man. It was an echo, a revenant of a time long past, driven only by the will of Valerius. And yet, despite the darkness, there was something else. Regret. Julien saw it in the way the knight hesitated, in the way it fought, not like a beast, but like a man who had once held honor. But there was no salvation for it now. Only an ending. The death blow. The knight lunged again, this time with desperation, its sword aimed for Julien's heart. Julien did not step back. He stepped forward. His blade met the knight's chest, driving through steel, darkness, and memory alike. For a moment the Wraith Knight froze, its form shuddering, the darkness within screaming in defiance. And then it collapsed. The armor clattered to the ground, empty. The knight was gone. The last remnants of Valerius' once loyal champion had finally been laid to rest. Julien lowered his sword, breathing heavily, his wounds stinging from cold and steel alike. But there was no time to rest, because, as the night faded, he saw it. The black coach, waiting at the edge of the ruined road. It had watched. It had fed. And in the distance, upon the wind, he heard the whisper of a voice he had come to fear. "You fight well, knight." Valerius. Julien's fingers tightened on his hilt. Each battle, each sight the black coach visited, was feeding the forgotten prince's resurrection. The knight he had just slain was not just another warrior. It had been a piece of Valerius's fragmented soul. And now it was one less obstacle between the prince and his return. He was running out of time. Julien stared at the black coach, its form flickering as it disappeared into the night, its master waiting for the next battlefield, the next sacrifice, the next piece of his soul to reclaim. Julien mounted Beaufort, ignoring the pain in his side. He had no choice now. He had to find the next battlefield before Valerius did. And he had to end this before the forgotten prince rose once more. Chapter 5. The Massacre at Grunwald Lodge. The path to the lodge. The moon hung swollen and pale over the dense, gnarled forest that smothered the land between Wertbad and the Grunwald hunting grounds. The trees here were not natural, twisted, bone-pale things, their roots clawing through the earth like the skeletal fingers of buried corpses. Julien had ridden for hours, chasing the black coach's trail. He could still feel the lingering cold of his battle with the Wraith Knight, the cut across his side aching with unnatural chill. But there was no time for rest, no time for wounds to heal. The black coach had stopped ahead. It was feeding. Julien could see the mist gathering, pooling in the spaces between the trees like a fog of the damned. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, that whatever lay ahead was not meant for mortal eyes. But he spurred Beaufort onward, because if he did not stop Valerius now, he never would. The Lodge of the Damned. At last the trees broke into a clearing, and there stood Grunwald Lodge, or what was left of it. It was a ruin. Once a noble hunting retreat, it had been abandoned for centuries, its blackened timbers rotting, its once grand windows shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. But the true horror was not in its decay. It was in the shadows. They moved unnaturally across the walls, not following the moon's light but slithering like living things. Wisps of black mist curled around the structure, weaving into the air like fingers dragging unseen horrors from the past. And in front of the ruined iron gates, standing motionless, was the black coach. It did not move, did not stir, yet it felt alive, as though it was listening, drinking, feeding on the echoes of slaughter. Julien dismounted, sword in hand, his breath slow and steady. As he approached the ruins, he saw them, the bodies, or what remained of them, a feast of the dead. Grunwald Lodge had been a place of nobility, a retreat for a powerful Stirland family, but there were no bones to bury, no grave markers for the dead. The walls were painted in dried blood, old, but never truly fading. Carvings of dark symbols were scorched into the wooden beams, etched in suffering, depicting twisted figures kneeling before something greater. The massacre had not been quick. They had been butchered here, not by war, not by raiders, but by something worse. A ritual of slaughter, an offering. To him, Julien turned to the black coach, and at that moment the shadows shifted. A whisper brushed against his mind. Blood calls to blood. The air grew thick, suffocating. The shadows pooled together, forming shapes, humanoid but wrong. The family of Grunwald Lodge had never truly left. And now they were rising, the silent ones. Julien took a step back, sword raised, as the shadows became solid. The noble family, the Grunwald, stood before him. Not alive, not dead, but something in between. Their eyes were empty sockets, their mouths sewn shut with threads of darkness. The children clutched at their torn throats, their silk garments stained in the crimson of their final night. The father, tall and withered, still wore his hunting cloak, though his chest was a ragged hole, gaping like a black wound in reality itself. They did not scream. They did not speak. They only moved. Julien reacted on instinct, stepping into a defensive stance as the first of the shadows lunged. Steel met darkness. His sword cleaved through the form of the eldest son, but no blood spilled. Instead, his body flickered, reshaping itself like mist swirling in reverse. It did not die. It simply reformed. They could not be slain like men. They were echoes of suffering, bound to this place, and the black coach was feeding on them. Every moment Julien stood here, Valerius grew stronger. The escape. Julien ducked low, evading a clawing hand, his sword flashing in an arc of silver light. Another spectre lunged, its fingers reaching for his throat, and he barely managed to twist away in time. He could not kill them. He could not save them. But he could escape. He turned, breaking into a sprint, dodging between rotting furniture and decayed beams, the whispers of the dead clawing at his mind. Stay with us. Join him. He burst from the ruins, racing toward Beaufort. The warhorse snorted in terror, sensing the malice that chased its master. Julien vaulted onto the saddle, spurring Beaufort into a gallop just as the shadows swarmed the clearing. They did not follow. They did not leave their prison. They only watched, and a black coach watched with them. The cost of failure. As Julien rode, he could feel it in his bones. Valerius was closer. The black coach had feasted, and he had been too late. The massacre at Grunwald Lodge had not been forgotten. It had been waiting, and now its suffering had been collected, another fragment of Valeria's lost soul reclaimed. Julien clenched his jaw, fury boiling within him. This could not happen again. He had to reach the next site before the black coach did. Because if he failed, if Valerius' resurrection was completed, then there would be no one left to stop him, and the world would bleed in silence. Chapter 6. The Knights of the Damned. The road of no return. The path ahead was cursed. Julien could feel it in his bones, in the weight of the air that pressed against his shoulders like an invisible burden. The further he rode from Grunwald Lodge, the deeper the land itself seemed to twist and darken. The trees lining the road were unnaturally still, their branches devoid of even the faintest rustling, despite the cold wind that cut through the night like a dagger. The black coach had already passed here. The land was tainted by its presence. Beaufort's hooves clattered against the dirt road, but even the warhorse, strong and fearless, felt the unnatural chill in the air. His muscles twitched, his ears flicked back, his nostrils flaring as if he could smell death upon the wind. Julien did not speak. Something was coming. Then, in the distance, he saw them. A procession in the fog. They emerged from the mist slowly, their shapes barely distinguishable at first. Horsemen, armored figures, banners held high. A band of knights. The Bretonnian knights. At first Julien's heart leapt with hope. Brothers in arms. Men of Bretonnia. noble knights who had ventured deep into this cursed land. Perhaps they had also heard of the black coach. Perhaps they, too, sought to destroy this horror before it was too late. He spurred Beaufort forward, drawing closer, his hand loosening from the grip of his sword. "Hail, knights of Bretonnia," he called. "What quest brings you to this forsaken land?" No answer. They rode in silence, their horses' hooves making no sound against the dirt road. Julien slowed. The fog parted as they came nearer, revealing them in full, and his blood ran cold. They were not men. They were not living knights. They were dead. Knights without souls? Their armor was rusted, their surcoats torn, once proud heraldry faded and decayed beyond recognition. Their banners drooped, the sigils of noble houses long erased by time. But their faces were the worst. Hollow, sunken, their eyes empty pits of darkness, their lips peeled back in silent, permanent grins of death. Yet they rode, straight-backed and proud, their posture still noble, still knightly, as if they had never truly acknowledged their own deaths. Julien's hand tightened on his sword. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice firm despite the chill creeping into his bones. Silence. The leader of the procession turned its head toward him. The motion was unnatural, slow and deliberate, the creak of rusted armor filling the still night air. Then, at last, a voice. "We are the damned." It was not spoken. It was whispered, a sound carried on the wind, as if it came from the grave itself. Julien's pulse pounded. He had heard stories of cursed knights, of those who had failed in their duty and were damned to ride eternally, their souls forever bound to the road. But these were different. They were Bretonnians. They had been knights of honor. And now they rode in silence, doomed to follow the black coach wherever it went. And then the leader spoke again. "Ride with us, brother." A shudder ran down Julien's spine. The fate that awaits? Julien gritted his teeth, gripping the reins of Beaufort tighter. This was a trick, a trap. They wanted him to ride with them, to join them. His eyes flicked toward their hands, their rusted weapons, their shields worn by centuries of battle. They had fought for something once. They had fought for Bretonnia, for the lady, for honor. And yet here they were, riding in undeath, enslaved to a master they could not defy. He swallowed the rising bile in his throat. "How did you fall?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Another knight turned its grinning skull toward him. "We followed the black coach. We thought we could stop it. We thought we were strong." Julien's heart stopped for a moment. "And now?" The leader gave the faintest shake of his head. "Now we ride. And when you fail, you will ride with us. Forever." A test of will. No. Julien's will hardened, his grip tightening on the reins. "I will not fail." The knights turned to face him fully, their hollow sockets gleaming with something dark and inevitable. Then, slowly, the leader extended his gauntleted hand toward Julien. "Then prove it." A challenge. Julien knew what this was. They were testing him, judging him. If he hesitated, if he showed doubt, they would take him, drag him into their ranks, into their eternal procession, and he would ride with them until the end of time. Julien raised his sword. "I ride alone." The knights stared at him for a long moment, their horses snorting mist into the cold air. Then, without a word, they turned their heads forward once more, and they rode on, fading into the mist, lost to the night. Leaving Julien behind? The road ahead. Julien sat motionless atop Beaufort, his body cold with something far worse than fear. This was his fate, should he fail. If he lost against Valerius, if the black coach completed its mission, he would not simply die. He would become one of them, a hollow knight, riding forever, chasing a horror that could not be stopped. No, he would not let that happen. Julien spurred Beaufort forward, riding with newfound urgency. There was no time to waste. The black coach had to be stopped, because if he failed, he would ride with them, and he would ride forever. Chapter 7. The Witch's Warning. The path through the cursed wood. The trees grew thick and tangled, their roots clawing through the earth like the skeletal remains of long dead things, their branches twisting together in an oppressive cage that swallowed the moonlight. Julien had ridden deep into the forgotten glade, a place known only in whispered warnings among the peasants of Sturland. They spoke of it as a wound in the land, a place where the dead did not rest, where the old gods had turned their backs, and where something else watched from the shadows, a place where the black coach had not yet ridden, but where its presence was already felt. His horse, Beaufort, moved slowly, its powerful legs treading with caution, its nostrils flaring at the stench of rot that hung in the air. Julien gripped the reins tightly, his other hand resting on the hilt of his sword, every sense on edge. The hedge witch lived somewhere ahead, if she still lived at all. The witch's hollow. He found it at last. A small, crumbling hut nestled between the roots of a great rotting oak, its walls draped in moss, its roof little more than twisted brambles and scavenged bones. The air thickened with an unnatural weight, like the world itself was watching, waiting to see if he would enter. The door creaked open before he could touch it. A voice rasped from the darkness within. "I smelled you from the moment you entered my woods, Knight. You bring the stench of death with you." Julien stepped inside, sword at the ready. The interior was a chaos of filth and age, dried herbs, bones strung together in intricate charms, old wax candles melted into grotesque shapes. The air reeked of mold, blood, and something older, something unnatural. At the far end of the hut, hunched over a fire pit that burned with green flame, was the witch. She was old, older than any mortal should be. Her flesh sagged like wet parchment over brittle bones. Her hair was tangled with twigs, her fingers long and clawed, her nails yellow with time. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They were black pits, endless and empty, and yet they saw everything. The truth of Valerius. Julien did not waste time. "I seek knowledge of the black coach," he said, his voice steady despite the weight in the air. "Of the one who rides within it." The witch smiled, her lips peeling back to reveal teeth too sharp, too numerous. "Ah, the forgotten prince," she murmured. "You chase the spectre of an empire that should have died long ago." She gestured toward the fire, and the flames roared higher, shifting from green to a sickly red-black, images twisting within the embers. "Do you understand what you hunt, Knight?" Julien's grip tightened on his sword. "I know enough." The witch laughed, a brittle, unnatural sound. "No, you do not." She thrust a hand into the fire, and the flames did not burn her. Instead, they revealed the truth. 3 anchors to a dead king. The first vision? A shattered corpse, bound in silver chains, entombed in a forgotten crypt deep beneath Sylvania. The remains of Valerius, still radiating malice, a body too broken to rise, but too powerful to be destroyed. The second vision, a ruined castle, its halls blackened with rot, its towers crumbling into the dead earth. Drakenhof Keep, the former seat of the Von Carstein dynasty, where the echoes of Valerius's rule lingered like a disease upon the stones. The third vision, a blur, something unclear, something hidden from even the witch's sight. A final tether, the last chain that bound Valerius to the mortal world. The vision faded, the fire returning to a dull green glow. The witch turned to him, her gaze heavy with knowing. "Cannot return fully until all 3 have been gathered." Julien's heart pounded. Valerius' soul was not just lingering, it was being pieced back together. And the black coach was traveling to each of these places, drawing the remnants of his power back to him. If all three anchors were claimed, Valerius would rise again. Whole, complete, unstoppable. The warning. Julien stepped forward, urgency in his voice. Then how do I destroy them? The witch's smile faltered, her black eyes flickering with something almost sorrowful. You cannot. His breath hitched. What? The witch gestured toward the symbols carved into the walls of her hut. Ancient markings of protection, of warding, of things far older than even the Empire. They tried before, long ago. The priests of Mor, the witch hunters, the necromancers who feared what he would become. She leaned in closer, her breath reeked of dust and decay. But he cannot be destroyed, Knight. Not truly. Only delayed. Rage flared in Julien's chest. This was not what he had come to hear. Then I will delay him. I will sever these anchors. I will make sure he never walks this world again. The witch studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled again, a sad smile, a knowing smile. And when you fail, you will ride with him. Julien clenched his fists, refusing to acknowledge the weight of her words. I will not fail. She only laughed. A gift for the night. As he turned to leave, the witch's clawed hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a strength that belied her frail form. A gift, Knight, for the road ahead. From a rotting wooden chest she pulled a vial of black liquid, swirling with strange silver flecks. Drink this when all seems lost, when the night has swallowed you whole. It may not save you, but it will show you the truth. Julien hesitated, then took the vial, tucking it into his belt. He did not trust her, but he trusted that the road ahead would be darker than he could imagine. Without another word, he mounted Beaufort, riding away from the cursed glade, his mind burning with what he had learned. 3 anchors, 3 sites where Valeria's soul was bound. 3 places he had to reach before the black coach. The hunt was no longer just about stopping the coach. It was about stopping the resurrection of something far worse. And if he failed, he would ride with the forgotten prince forever. Chapter 8. The Desecration of Mor's Hollow. The journey to the hollow. The road twisted through the dying trees, their barren limbs stretching toward the sky like grasping hands. The land here was old, sacred, untouched by war or mortal settlements. Mor's Hollow, a place where the dead were laid to rest with solemn rites, where priests of the god of death ensured the departed were not disturbed. Now it was silent, too silent. Julien rode with urgency, the weight of the hedge witch's warning pressing against his chest. If Mor's Hollow had fallen, then one of the forgotten prince's anchors was already broken, and Valerius would be one step closer to rising in full. The crows had vanished. The air was thick, heavy, with a scent that did not belong in the realm of the living, a mixture of stagnant rot and something else. Something wrong. Beaufort snorted, his muscles trembling beneath Julien's grip. The warhorse had been raised in battle, had charged through blood and death, but here. And then Julien saw it. Mor's Hollow was ruined. The desecrated graves. The grand mausoleums, the sacred crypts, the hallowed fields where Stirland's noble dead were laid to rest. Defiled. Ripped open. Desecrated beyond mortal comprehension. The stone gates of Mor's temple were broken and charred, the sacred sigils of the priests of Mor scratched out, burned away by something unnatural. The vast burial fields, once neatly arranged with gravestones and holy markers, were now nothing but gaping holes, their occupants stolen from the earth. The graves were empty, thousands of them. No corpses, no skeletal remains. only the disturbed soil, as if the earth itself had vomited up the dead. And in the center of the ruined cemetery, the black coach's tracks were burned into the ground, like scars of a wound that would never heal. Julien dismounted, his breath coming in slow, deliberate draws. He was too late. The dead had already been taken. A gust of wind howled through the hollow, carrying with it a whisper that was not made by the living. Julien's sword left its scabbard in an instant. He was not alone. The unholy procession. At first there was nothing, only the stillness of the ruined graveyard, the cold bite of the wind. Then the air turned black. Shadows thickened at the edges of his vision. The ground trembled. The first one rose slowly, emerging from the ruins of the temple, a priest of Mar, but not as it once had been. A wraith, twisted beyond recognition. The black robes of its order were now tattered rags, its flesh a sickly, translucent gray, stretched too thin over bones too sharp, too unnatural. Its eyes were hollow, black pits. And in its skeletal hands it held a warped censer, its chain rusted, swinging with a sound like rattling bones. And it was not alone. From the gaping graves, from the ruined crypts, they came. Priests, monks, and the dead they once swore to protect. No longer men, no longer mortal, servants of the forgotten prince. The attack of the undead priests. The first wraith rushed him, its censers swinging in an arc, but no incense came forth. Instead, a black mist spewed from its depths, a foul, unnatural vapor that reeked of decay and corruption. Julien twisted away, rolling beneath the strike. The second wraith lunged from behind, its clawed fingers reaching for his throat. He spun, his sword flashing in the darkness. Steel met shadow. The wraith shrieked, its form splitting apart like smoke caught in a storm, its body twisting in agony. But it did not die. It reformed. Their bodies were not flesh. Their bodies were suffering, and suffering could not be slain. The censer wraith struck again, its rusted chain wrapping around Julien's arm, burning with the cold fire of undeath. Pain shot through his bones, a searing cold worse than steel, as if his very essence was being ripped away. They were trying to drain him, trying to make him one of them, trying to add him to the hollowed ranks of Valerius' army. The knight's fury. No. Julien's teeth clenched, his vision swimming as the cold dug deeper into his bones. He would not fall here. He would not become one of them. He would not fail. With a roar he tore free, his sword flashing in a desperate counterattack. One wraith fell, its form dispersing into mist. A second recoiled, shrieking as his steel bit into its cursed robes. A third wraith lunged, only to meet the warhorse's steel-shod hooves as Buford reared, crushing it beneath his weight. The shadows writhed, howling in voices that were not voices, a chorus of wailing agony. But they did not stop coming. They would never stop coming. And then the air shifted. The black coach had returned. The black coach fees. Julien turned, breath ragged, sword coated in black mist, as the ruined road leading into Mar's hollow darkened. It appeared like a nightmare given form. Its wheels did not touch the ground. The air rippled in its wake. The undead priests turned as one, their empty sockets locking onto the black coach, their shrieks turning to whispers of reverence. They were bowing to him, and within the black coach's shadowed interior, something moved. Not fully formed, not yet whole, but waking. Valerius. Julien's heart hammered. He had failed. The hollow dead of Mor's sacred resting place had been twisted into Valerius' servants, their souls devoured, their suffering absorbed. Another piece of the forgotten prince had been restored. Another chain had been reforged. Valerius was one step closer to resurrection. Julien knew he could not win here. He was outnumbered, surrounded by things that did not die. He had to escape. He spurred Beaufort into a full gallop, his sword flashing as he cut down a final wraith, tearing through the fog and death, leaving the cursed cemetery behind. But as he fled, as he put distance between himself and the black coach, he heard it, a voice from within the coffin, soft, but growing stronger. "Run, little knight. It will not matter. The night belongs to me." Chapter 9. The Blood Toll of Essen Wald. The Stench of Fear. The village of Essen Wald was small, a crumbling speck of civilization nestled between the gnarled forests of Stirling and the jagged hills that bordered Sylvania. Once it had been a prosperous logging town, its people feeding the empire's ever-hungry need for timber and charcoal. Now it was a corpse of a place. Julien smelled it before he saw it, the distinct, pungent scent of sweat and fear. Even through the damp air and the rot of the woods, it clung to the wind like a sickness. Something was wrong here. Beaufort whinnied, uneasy beneath him, his hooves kicking up dirt as they approached the edge of the village. The houses were intact but lifeless, curtains drawn tight, doors barred, the streets eerily empty. And in the center of the square, beneath the looming shadow of the old town hall, stood a wooden platform. Julien narrowed his eyes. It was an altar, a place of sacrifice, and the black coach tracks led straight to it. The blood pact of Essen Wald. The villagers were hiding. He could feel their eyes upon him, peering from the cracks between shutters, their whispered prayers and muffled sobs carried through the still air. But some were not hiding. A group of men and women, garbed in ragged peasant robes, stood around the altar, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They moved with the slow, mechanical rhythm of people whose souls had already left them. They were waiting, and upon the altar, bound with iron chains, knelt 4 figures. A boy, barely more than 10. A woman, tears carving rivers through the dirt on her face. An old man, his frail form trembling in the cold. And a young man, perhaps no older than Julien himself, staring blankly at the sky. Waiting to die, Julien felt his stomach turn. His grip on the reins tightened. He dismounted in an instant, his boots hitting the ground hard as he strode toward the platform. "Stop this." The villagers turned to him, their expressions neither shocked nor angered. They simply looked tired. The oldest of them, a gray-bearded man draped in a priest's tattered robes, stepped forward. His face was gaunt, his skin pale from malnutrition, his eyes dead inside his skull. "You do not understand," the priest rasped. "We have no choice." Julien's jaw clenched. "You always have a choice," he spat. "What are you doing?" The priest's hands trembled as he gestured toward the altar. "The black coach, it comes," he whispered. "It has already taken others. It will not stop, but if we offer blood, if we give it what it wants, it will pass us by." Julien felt something hot rise in his chest. Anger, disgust, a sickness deeper than revulsion. "You would feed it?" he snarled. "You would offer your own people to a monster?" The priest's lips quivered, but there was no guilt in his expression, only resignation. "We have no warriors, no silver, no hope." His fingers tightened into fists. "We have only blood." The rage inside Julien burned. These people were victims, and yet they had turned themselves into accomplices. And it was too late to reason with them, because the air was shifting. The black coach had arrived. The arrival of the coach. A cold wind tore through the village, extinguishing lanterns, shaking rooftops. A terrible silence fell over Essen Wald. And then the bells of the chapel tolled, though no one had touched them. The ground trembled, and from the mist it emerged. The black coach rolled into the square, its rotting wood groaning, its skeletal horses silent as death. Its wheels left scorch marks upon the cobbled stone, and with every inch it moved forward, the air grew colder, the color bled from the world. Julien stood before it, his sword drawn. This was what he had come for. He would not let this happen. The villagers fell to their knees, whispering prayers to nothing, to no one, to the empty air. The priest lifted his arms. "We offer this blood freely. Take them and spare us." Julien moved. Too late. The black coach door creaked open. A gust of air erupted from its depths, unnatural and hungry, and the altar ignited. The consuming fire. It was not flame, not in the way that fire should burn. It was spectral, unnatural, a blaze of cursed white. It devoured the sacrifices in an instant. The boy screamed, his voice cut short as his body crumbled into ash. The woman, her eyes wide with terror, reached out, but she was already gone, her body dissolving like a whisper lost in the wind. The old man, too frail to even scream, simply vanished, his flesh and bones turning to dust before he could even understand what was happening. And the young man, the last of them, simply looked up, his lips moving as if whispering a prayer. And then he was nothing. Their remains were not left behind. They were taken, absorbed. Their suffering fed into the depths of the black coach, feeding Valerius. The wrath of a knight. Julien could not stop what had already happened, but he could make them pay for it. His fury exploded into motion. He charged. Steel flashing. Blade aimed straight for the heart of the black coach. The priest screamed as he saw Julien's intent, but the knight did not falter. He struck. His sword slammed into the rotting wood, and the world split apart. A shockwave of black force erupted from the coach, hurling Julien backward, his body smashing against the cold stone. His vision blurred, his breath torn from his lungs. And in his moment of helplessness, he heard it. A voice from within the coach. Soft, gentle, almost amused. Ah, a knight. A hero. Still so stubborn, even as the night closes around you. Valerius. The black coach shuddered, its horses rearing, hooves striking air, its power swelling from the blood it had taken. And then it was gone, vanished into the mist, leaving only the echoes of its hunger behind. Julien forced himself to his feet, his hands shaking, his breath ragged. He had failed. Again. And somewhere, deep within the black coach's cursed form, Valerius had grown stronger. Chapter 10. Duel at the Cursed Bridge. The ambush is set. Julien's hands trembled with pain, his side still raw from the battle at Essen Wald. The scars from the wraith priest of Moor's Hollow still burned beneath his armor, a deep chill lingering in his bones like a curse that refused to fade. And yet he rode forward. The black coats had escaped him too many times. Each village it passed through, each ruin it fed upon, brought Valerius closer to resurrection. He was running out of time, and he knew it. But this time, he would not chase the black coach. This time, he would make it come to him. The ruined bridge of Alzhoek was a relic of a war long forgotten, spanning a deep, treacherous ravine. The river beneath was dark and still, a winding black ribbon cutting through the corpse of the land. The stone bridge was cracked, half collapsed in places, its pillars eaten away by centuries of rain and neglect. Few dared to cross it anymore, save for those with nowhere else to go, or those who did not fear the dead. The black coach was traveling northward. It would have to pass this way, and when it did, Julien would be waiting. The trap is sprung. Julien knelt at the base of the bridge's entrance, concealing himself in the thick underbrush, his warhorse, Buford, hidden further up the road. He had stripped his armor of any excess weight, his body coiled with tension, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. The night was cold, thick with mist, the sound of the river below barely audible. Then, the wind died. The birds stopped singing. The world grew silent. Julien exhaled slowly. It was coming. A deep, unnatural humming filled the air. The ground trembled beneath him, the cursed road blackening as unseen forces stirred the very stones. Then he saw it. The black coach emerged from the mist, rolling forward without sound, its skeletal horses moving in perfect unison, their bodies wrapped in strips of ethereal shadow, hooves leaving no marks upon the dirt. The wheels did not turn, they glided. It was unnatural, a thing that should not exist. The coffin-shaped interior shuddered, its iron hinges creaking, its wood burned black from ages of rot and malice. Julien felt its presence. He had no doubt Valerius was inside. The moment it reached the center of the bridge, Julien moved. He kicked Beaufort's reins, and the warhorse charged from its hiding place. Sword drawn, eyes blazing with fury. "I name you abomination. You will go no further." The black coach jerked to a halt. The air around it shifted. And then the door creaked open. The Wraith Knight emerges. Julien's blood ran cold. From within the black coach, a figure stepped out. It was not Valerius. It was something else. Something worse. The knight emerged, clad in tattered armor, black as midnight, its edges corroded with the stains of centuries of bloodshed. The crest upon its chest had long since been worn away, but the shape remained, a sigil of household and honor, twisted beyond recognition. It had been a knight once, but now it was a thing of undeath. Its face was hollow, a dark pit of nothingness beneath its rusted helm, and in its hands it held a sword unlike any mortal weapon, a blade wreathed in necrotic energy. A weapon that did not merely kill, but unmade. It spoke no words. It simply raised its blade and charged. The duel begins. The clash of steel against cursed iron shook the night. Julien met the Wraith Knight's strike head-on, his own sword shimmering with holy fury, clashing against the unholy darkness that sought to consume him. The impact nearly shattered his arms. The Wraith Knight was impossibly strong. Julien twisted, sidestepping a follow-up strike, bringing his own blade up in a precise arc, but the Wraith moved too fast, dodging like smoke caught in the wind. It was not just a knight, it was an executioner, and it had come to finish him. Julien ducked low, his sword flashing up in a brutal thrust, aimed at the Wraith's exposed side. A hit, but no blood spilled. Only shadow. The knight did not falter. It twisted, its cursed blade arcing toward Julien's side. Pain exploded through his ribs. Julien gasped, staggering back, his armor sliced open, the wound burning like frozen fire. The sword was more than steel. It was eating at him. The Wraith Knight strode forward, its hollow gaze fixed upon him, ready to finish the job. The killing blow. No, not like this. Not here. Julien gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, forcing himself to move. A knight does not falter. A knight does not yield. A knight fights. He lunged forward, dropping low as the Wraith swung again. This time, he did not block. He sidestepped, using his own wound as leverage, twisting his body past the Wraith Knight's defenses, and drove his blade straight through its chest. A horrible, screeching wail erupted from its hollow form. The air around them cracked, split apart, the Wraith convulsing, its form unraveling like a dying star. Julien twisted the blade, forcing the cursed knight to its knees. For a moment, its helmeted head turned toward him, and in its blackened, empty sockets, there was sorrow. Then it was gone. The armor collapsed into dust, and the knight fell silent. A hollow victory. Julien dropped to one knee, blood pooling from his wound, his breathing ragged, uneven. He had won, but he had lost too, because as he forced himself up, as he turned toward where the black coat had been, it was gone. It had watched, and it had left. Julien staggered, his fingers tightening into fists. Another battle, another failure. Valerius was still out there, and the night was far from over. Chapter 11. The Whispering Barrow. The path to the forgotten grave. The forest of dead trees stretched for miles, their bark blackened with age, their branches gnarled and twisted as if clawing toward a sky that had long since abandoned them. Mist clung to the earth, swirling in unnatural shapes, curling like fingers around Julien's boots as he rode deeper into the forsaken land. He was close, he could feel it. The witch's words still echoed in his mind. The first anchor lies where the forgotten prince first fell, where bones weep and the dead call for vengeance. The barrow, a forgotten tomb of kings and warriors, now nothing more than a gaping wound in the land, its corridors suffocated by the weight of centuries of suffering. Julien felt the chill long before he saw it. His warhorse Beaufort reared back, snorting, refusing to take another step. The beast knew death was near. Julien exhaled slowly, dismounting, his boots sinking into the cold, damp soil. He placed a hand on the horse's neck, whispering a quiet reassurance, then pressed forward on foot. He was alone now. As he passed the final stretch of withered trees, he saw it. A stone mound, half buried beneath centuries of decay, its entrance framed by two crumbling statues of faceless knights. The air around it was thick, suffocating, a weight pressing against his chest. The whispers began, the voices of the damned. Julien. The voice was soft, almost gentle, a woman's voice filled with sorrow. You are not meant to be here. Another voice, a child's. Turn back, knight, you cannot stop him. Julien's fingers tightened around his sword. They knew his name. They had been waiting for him. The air inside the barrow's entrance shifted, and suddenly the shadows moved, curling toward him like grasping hands. Julien stepped forward, and the tomb swallowed him whole. Inside the forgotten crypt, the air within the barrow was thick with the scent of rot and old blood. The stone corridors stretched endlessly downward, twisting into the earth like a labyrinth carved from sorrow. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, depicting scenes of battle, betrayal, and death. Julien's boots echoed in the silence, his sword drawn, his breath slow and measured. The air was too heavy, thick with something more than just death. Something was awake down here. A gust of wind brushed past his ear, though there was no wind in this place. And the whispers returned. He's coming. You are too late. Turn back, knight. He did not turn back. He pressed deeper, the corridor narrowing, the stone walls pressing in, as if the grave itself was trying to swallow him. And then he found the chamber, the remains of the forgotten prince. The tomb was vast, its ceiling lost to shadows, its walls carved with ancient symbols of Sylvania's lost nobility. The remains lay at the center. A broken skeleton, draped in the remnants of a noble's burial garb, bound in silver chains, hammered deep into the stone. A shattered crown lying beside it, covered in dust. Julien felt his breath catch in his throat. This was Valerius? Or at least, what was left of him. If he could destroy the remains, sever this connection, he could stop the black coach from drawing strength here. But something was wrong. As he stepped forward, his sword raised. The air hardened. An unseen force struck him in the chest. Julien was hurled backward, crashing into the stone floor. The guardian of the tomb. The whispers grew louder, no longer hushed voices, but a wailing chorus of agony. Something was protecting the remains. Julien forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. And then he saw it. A shadow peeled itself from the walls, rising like a living nightmare, twisting and curling into the shape of a knight clad in ancient, ruined armor. Its eyes burned red, and in its hands it held a rusted great sword, the blade dripping with black mist. It was no mortal knight. It was a shade of loyalty, a last protector, bound by oath even in death. And it was here to stop him. The wraith charged, its great sword arcing toward Julien's head. Julien barely raised his blade in time. The impact sent a shockwave of cold through his bones. The shade was relentless, its strikes furious, each swing carrying the weight of centuries of servitude. Julien dodged left, rolling beneath a downward slash, his own blade flashing upward. He struck. Steel met shadow. The wraith staggered, shrieking in rage, its form flickering like a dying flame. It was vulnerable, but before Julien could land another blow, the wraith thrust its arm forward. A wave of force sent him crashing against the tomb wall. Pain exploded through his ribs, the air torn from his lungs. The wraith did not fight like a man. It fought like a force of nature, and it was winning, a desperate gambit. Julien coughed, blood on his lips, his limbs weak from the unnatural cold. The wraith strode forward, raising its blade for the final strike. Julien had only one chance. He feigned weakness, lowering his sword slightly. A bait. The wraith took it. It lunged, and Julien moved. With a last burst of strength, he rolled to the side, bringing his blade up in a brutal, two-handed arc. The sword cut deep into the wraith's chest. The creature shrieked, its form splintering, shadows unraveling like torn fabric. Julien didn't hesitate. He struck again, and again, until there was nothing left but silence. The wraith was gone, and the force that had protected Valerius' remains had vanished with it. The first anchor is broken. Julien staggered forward, his sword dragging against the stone. He stood over the remains of the forgotten prince, the shattered skeleton, the ruined chains. He lifted his sword and brought it down. The bones splintered into dust. The chains cracked and crumbled. And somewhere in the distance, the blackcoats screamed. The tomb began to shake, the walls cracking, the air splitting with unseen rage. Julien ran. He sprinted back through the barrow, the whispers turning to screams of rage, the very earth trying to bury him alive. He burst from the tomb just as the entrance collapsed, the weight of ages sealing the crypt forever. The first anchor was broken, but as he turned toward the road, toward the place where the black coach would come next, he knew the fight was far from over. Chapter 12. The Black Coach at Midnight. The world holds its breath. The tomb had collapsed behind him, a thunderous roar of stone and dust swallowed by the endless dark of the forest. Julien staggered forward, bloodied, wounded, his ribs screaming with every breath. His blade was slick with the remnants of the Wraith Knight, and his legs trembled from exhaustion. But he had done it. The first anchor of Valerius was broken. He took a ragged breath, placing a hand against a tree to steady himself. The night air was cold, too cold, seeping into his bones like the fingers of something unseen. His warhorse Beaufort waited at the edge of the clearing, ears flattened in fear, hooves shifting uneasily. The beast was restless, sensing something wrong, something unnatural in the air. Julien turned toward him, ready to mount, ready to ride far from this cursed place. And then he felt it. The air shifted. The ground trembled. A deep, suffocating silence settled over the land, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. And then the black coach arrived. A carriage of the damned. It did not emerge from the tree line. It simply appeared. A thing of rotted wood and blackened iron, its wheels turning without sound, its skeletal horses motionless, their eye sockets burning with the dim, pale glow of grave light. The air around it shimmered, twisting like heat upon the summer road, but there was no warmth here, only the unbearable weight of death itself. The coach door remained closed, yet Julien could feel something within it, something watching him. He had faced monsters before, faced creatures of nightmare, but this was different. This was a presence, a hunger, a slow, steady pulse of ancient malice. And then it spoke. The voice of the forgotten prince. The voice was not a voice at all. It was a whisper, curling into the air like smoke, like something unspoken between the living and the dead. "You fight well, Knight." Julien froze. It was inside his head, a voice without sound, a whisper of shadow pressing against the edges of his thoughts. To stand against the inevitable, such a foolish endeavor. Julien's fingers tightened around his sword hilt. It was him, Valerius. The presence in the black coach was no longer a mere fragment. It was growing, coalescing, becoming something more than a shade. "You wound me, little knight." There was no mockery in the voice. No anger, only certainty. "But you cannot stop me." Julien exhaled, forcing himself to speak. "You will not return," he hissed. A chuckle, soft, cold, eternal. "I already have." The unseen power. Julien took a step back, his legs protesting with pain, his vision swimming from exhaustion. He had nothing left. He could not fight now. He had barely survived the Wraith Knight. He had fought too many battles, bled too much. And Valerius knew it. "You need not run, Julien." The way Valerius spoke his name made his skin crawl. Like a thing already certain of its victory. Like a king addressing a kneeling subject. "Do you not tire of this, the endless struggle, the pain, the doubt?" The black coat shifted, its presence looming, pressing against the very fabric of the night. "You have seen it already. You know how this ends." Julien's grip wavered. For the first time he felt it. The pull. The slow, whispering tendrils of Valerius's will, curling around the edges of his thoughts, tempting, twisting, unraveling. It would be so easy to let go, to stop fighting, to join the Knights of the Damned, to ride beside the forgotten prince, to let the world rot as it was always meant to. Now, with a snarl, Julien forced the thoughts from his mind, shoving the whispers aside. He was a knight of Bretonnia. He would not bow. Not to a ghost, not to a king of nothing. Flight into the wilds. Buford screamed. The black coach shuddered, its door creaking open. He was coming. He had wasted too much time. Julien spun, threw himself onto the saddle, and kicked hard. Buford launched forward, hooves pounding against the soil, breath steaming in the freezing air. The black coach did not follow. It didn't need to. The shadows did. They peeled away from the mist, unnatural things with no faces, no bodies, only the whispering, hungry tendrils of Valerius's will, stretching, reaching. Julien's sword flashed. Steel met shadow. A scream, not human, not wraith, but something deeper, something ancient, shook the air. The shadow writhed, recoiling, but another rose in its place. They were endless. He had to outrun them. Buford charged through the cursed road, tearing through twisting roots, broken branches, blackened underbrush. The shadows kept pace, whispering, reaching. Then the trees broke. A ravine. Julien did not slow. He had one chance. He leaned forward, urging Beaufort onward. Faster, faster. Then they laughed. The horse soared through the air, clearing the ravine just as the shadows reached the edge. The black tendrils lashed out, too late. Julien landed hard, his bones rattling, Beaufort nearly stumbling before regaining his stride. He looked back. The black coach had vanished. The shadows had retreated. Valerius had let him go. A wounded victory. Julien rode until the first light of dawn touched the treetops. Only then did he stop, gasping for breath, his body racked with pain, his wounds throbbing. He had escaped, but he had not won. Valerius had spoken to him. He was more than a shadow now. He was returning. Julien gritted his teeth, wiping blood from his lip. This was not the end. The hunt would continue, and next time, he would not run. Chapter 13. The Durge of the Dead. A Song Upon the Wind. Julien's wounds still burned. His ribs ached, his muscles trembled beneath his battered armor, and the whispers of Valerius lingered in his mind like the aftertaste of a poison he could not spit out. He had fled from the black coat, but the hunt was not over. The first anchor was broken, the shattered bones of Valerius's mortal remains now lost beneath the rubble of the barrow. But Valerius had spoken. He was still tethered to the world. And Julien needed answers. A village that should not be. The road wound deep into the cursed lands, where the trees stood silent, where the air was thick with the weight of forgotten things. By dawn, he had come upon a village that was not on any map. A place that should not exist. The houses were intact but lifeless, standing as though their occupants had simply vanished. The streets were too clean, too undisturbed, the air too still. No birds, no voices, no life. Yet, in the center of the village square, there was a sound, a single voice, singing. The bard in black, seated upon a broken fountain, his fingers drifting lazily across the strings of a lute, was a man clad in black. He was alone, and he was waiting. His cloak was tattered, his boots worn to the leather, his face pale yet untouched by the ravages of time. His hair was silver, though he was no old man. And his eyes. Julien had seen eyes like that before. Eyes that had seen death but refused to close. The bard's song was soft, lilting through the empty streets like the last notes of a funeral dirge. It was a song for the dead, a warning from the damned. Julien approached slowly, his sword hand ready. The bard did not stop playing. He simply smiled, as if he had been expecting him. A knight of Britannia. How rare. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, a sorrow that lingered like the last embers of a dying fire. Julien frowned. "Who are you?" The bard's fingers plucked a final note, then rested upon the strings. "Once, I was simply Emmerich of Caron, a humble minstrel, a singer of love and war." His smile did not reach his eyes. "But now I am the herald of a dead king." Julien's breath caught. He knew the truth of Valerius' spirit. The bard stood, slinging the lute across his back. "You seek the final anchor, the last chain binding the forgotten prince to this world." Julien nodded slowly. "Tell me, where is it? How do I break it?" The bard's expression darkened. "You cannot break what was never whole." He gestured toward the horizon, beyond the woods, beyond the mist-laden lands of Stirland. "The final anchor lies in Mion." Julien's heart froze. Mion, the cursed city, the place where Britannia's greatest shame festered like a rotting wound, a city of betrayed kings, lost souls, and drowned honor. The tragedy that binds a prince. Emmerich turned back toward him, his silver eyes unreadable. Valerius was not always a creature of darkness. Once, long ago, he was a prince of Britannia. Julien's breath hitched. That was not possible. Valerius Von Carstein was a noble of Sylvania, a vampire prince, a terror of the night. He was not of Britannia. He could not be. The bard smiled as if reading his thoughts. "Do you truly think all evil is born in the darkness? Some of it is made in the light, knight. Some of it is forged in love. in betrayal, in loss. He gestured toward the west. Mion is where his final sorrow lies. The pain of his greatest defeat, the last wound upon his soul. Julien felt the weight of the witch's prophecy settling upon him. The third anchor was not a place. It was a memory, a moment frozen in time. And if it was in Mion, it meant one thing. Valerius had unfinished business with Bretonnia. A grim path forward. Julien clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had come to destroy a vampire, to stop the return of a Sylvanian horror. But this was no longer a simple hunt. This was a war between past and present, between oaths broken and vengeance unfulfilled. And if he truly wanted to stop Valerius, he had to return to the most cursed city in Bretonnia. He had to go to Mion. The bard's final warning. Emmerich stepped forward, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. You must be careful, Knight. You are walking a path that many before you have taken, and none have returned. Julien's grip on his sword tightened. I do not fear Mion. The bard's expression did not change. He said. He plucked a single note from his lute, a sound too mournful for words. Then he turned, walking into the mist, his figure fading like a ghost before Julien could say another word. The bard was gone, and the dirge had ended. The road to Mion. Julien exhaled slowly, turning toward his horse. He had his answer. The hunt was taking him home. The one place in Britannia he had sworn never to tread. He took the reins of Beaufort, staring toward the distant horizon, where the cursed waters of Mion waited. If Valerius' final anchor lay there, then that was where he would go, no matter what waited for him in the ruins of the drowned city, no matter if it was already too late. Chapter 14. A Knight's Doubt. The road to Mion. The road was long. The road was dark. Julien de Calmont rode alone, the path ahead swallowed by black mist, the trees along the road twisted and dead, their skeletal branches reaching for him like the hands of the damned. He had always been certain of his purpose. The Lady of the Lake had called him to this quest. But certainty was slipping away. The black coach had spoken to him. Its whispers had curled around his mind, slithering into the cracks left by his failures. And the wounds from his battles, the Wraith Knight, the cursed priests, the barrow's guardian, had not healed. They festered, not with infection, but with something unnatural. A sickness of the soul. Something was changing inside him. And with every mile he rode toward Mion, the doubt grew deeper. The dream begins. Julien did not remember falling asleep. The exhaustion had overtaken him, like a wave crashing upon a shipwreck. One moment he was sitting beside his small fire, sharpening his sword. The next, he was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. The shadowed hall. He stood within a grand hall, its walls blackened, its banners tattered, remnants of nobility long lost. The air was thick with the scent of old blood. Candles dripped black wax upon the stone, their light flickering like dying stars. And at the far end of the hall, a throne of bone and ruin. Seated upon it, half shrouded in mist, was Valerius von Carstein. He was not fully formed, his body flickered, his presence a weight upon the world rather than flesh and blood. But his eyes burned crimson, and he was smiling. The first whisper, "You fight so desperately, little knight." The words did not come from his lips. They came from everywhere. A whisper upon the cold air, curling through the pillars, threading through the shadows, sinking into the depths of Julien's mind. Valerius tilted his head, amused. "Do you even know why you fight anymore?" Julien clenched his fists. "I fight because it is right." The smile widened. "Right? According to whom?" The second whisper. The candles flickered, and suddenly Julien was no longer standing alone. He turned and saw the Knights of the Damned, the same Bretonnian warriors he had encountered upon the road, their armor rusted, their flesh long rotted away, yet still riding, still bound to the service of the black coach. Valerius' voice curled around him. They fought as you do, and they failed, and now they ride with me. One of the knights stepped forward, his gauntleted hands resting upon the hilt of a sword as black as midnight. He was familiar, too familiar. Julien's heart stopped. The sigil on the knight's chest. It was his own, the silver falcon of House Calmont. The third whisper. You cannot stop what is coming. The words slithered into his ears, into his very soul, twisting like daggers of ice. He was seeing the future, his own fate. Valerius's voice was softer now, almost kind. Fight against the inevitable, Julien. You have already lost. The knight's doubt became a wound, a festering thing, a poison, the knight's temptation. The black coach was more than just death. It was power. It was freedom from suffering. Julien's wounds burned, his body weak from exhaustion, from pain, from the futility of it all. If he let go, the pain would stop. If he surrendered, he would no longer suffer. If he knelt, he would ride beside the forgotten prince, and nothing, not age, not wounds, not death, would touch him again. He could see it now, a new banner, the black falcon of House Calmont, raised high among the legions of the dead. His armor would never rust. His blade would never dull. His war would never end. A night eternal. And all he had to do was kneel. The final whisper. Julien stared at the throne. Valerius watched him. Wait. The choice was his. For a moment he wavered. His fingers ached to let go of his sword. His knees threatened to buckle. The weight of his failures, his pain, the unrelenting agony of his body, it would be so easy. So easy. A knight's defiance. No, not like this. Not here. Not ever. With a roar of fury, Julien ripped himself from the vision, his sword flashing in an arc of silver light. The black coat shuddered. Valerius' smile faded, and the throne crumbled into dust. Awakening to darkness, Julien gasped awake, his body drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. The black coach was gone, but the whispers remained. His wounds ached. His armor was cold against his skin. And the doubt had never felt stronger. He ran a shaking hand over his face, forcing himself to stand, forcing himself to breathe. The black coach had tried to break him. But he was still here, still fighting. He pulled himself onto Beaufort's saddle, his hands tightening upon the reins. Mausoleum lay ahead, and if the whispers were right, if Valerius had truly been born from a tragedy in Bretonnia's cursed city, then it was time for Julien to face it, to face Valerius, to prove that he was still a knight of the living and not the dead. Chapter 15. The Mausoleum of the Carsteins. A city of the dead. The ruins of Drakenhof Keep loomed on the horizon, its blackened towers crumbling, its once great banners tattered remnants of forgotten glories. The castle had once been the heart of Sylvania's vampiric rule, but now it was nothing more than a monument to ancient cruelty and silent horror. Julien's journey had led him here. The black coach had passed this way, and deep within the keep, beneath layers of forgotten stone and rotting nobility, lay the mausoleum of the Von Carsteins. It was said that no living man had ever entered and left unchanged. Julien had no choice but to try. The descent into darkness. The entrance to the mausoleum was hidden behind a fallen chapel, its stained glass shattered, its altar desecrated beyond recognition. Holy ground did not exist in Sylvania. The tunnel leading downward was a gaping wound in the earth, lined with aged stone and crumbling murals, their depictions of the Von Carstein bloodline worn away by time and the weight of suffering. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Not the cold of winter, but of something older, something watching. His breath misted in the air. And then the voices began, the lament of the forgotten lords. "You walk among the dead, knight." The words were not spoken aloud. They came from the walls, from the air, from the stone itself. Julien's grip tightened on his sword. The corridor opened into a vast underground chamber, lined with tombs stretching into the dark, their coffins lined with the sigils of the Carstein lineage. But none of them were sealed. All had been opened. The spirits lingered, curling like mist above their ruined crypts, their forms barely human, skeletal remnants wrapped in the tattered finery of long-dead nobility. They did not attack. They did not rage. They watched. "You have come to fight the forgotten prince. You will fail." Julien's fingers tensed upon the hilt of his sword. "I do not fear him," he growled. Laughter, hollow, sorrowful. "You do not understand him." The truth of Valerius. Julien stepped forward, his boots echoing upon the stone. "If you know what he is, then tell me." A shudder ran through the chamber as the spirits swirled, their forms shifting into memories of ages past. And then the truth began to unravel. A prince betrayed. Valerius von Carstein had not always been a monster. He had been a man, a noble, a ruler, a prince of Drakenhof. The spirits showed Julien glimpses of a time when Sylvania had not yet fallen to shadow, when the von Carstein family was still one among many noble houses of the empire. But Valerius had been different. He had sought power beyond mortal kingship. He had sought eternity. He thought himself greater than his fate. He believed he could master death, and for that arrogance he was cursed. A curse worse than death. Julien watched as the spirits shaped the past, revealing the moment of Valerius' doom. He had not been turned willingly. He had been betrayed. His own kin, fearing his ambition, had conspired against him. They had lured him into a trap, into a ritual not of immortality but of punishment. They did not turn him into a lord of undeath. They turned him into something worse. His soul was shattered, his mind twisted. His body became the beast you now hunt. The black coach was not just a vessel of power. It was his prison, a coffin that carried the fragments of a man who had once been great, now twisted into something neither living nor truly dead. A warning to the night. The spirits turned to Julien, their hollow eyes burning with quiet sorrow. You fight a creature bound not by hunger but by grief. He does not seek only power. He seeks to finish what he began. Julien's breath hitched. What does he want? The spirits began to fade, their forms receding into the tombs. He wants to be whole again. And when he is, the world will kneel before a king of the dead. The final anchor was all that remained. The ruins of Mion called, and Julien had to stop him before it was too late. The road to Mion. Julien turned away from the Mausoleum, his body racked with exhaustion, his mind heavy with what he had learned. Valerius was not merely a monster. He was a tragedy unfinished. And if Julien failed, Valerius would not only rise, he would claim the throne of a kingdom lost to history, the throne of Bretonnia itself. With renewed purpose, Julien mounted Beaufort, staring toward the distant horizon. The final battle lay ahead. The knight and the prince would meet in Mion, and only one would leave the cursed city alive. Chapter 16. The City of Lost Souls. The Cursed Road to Mion. The road into Mion was one of silence and suffering, The further Julien rode, the heavier the air became, thick with a stagnant rot that clung to his armor, seeped into his lungs, and soured his very thoughts. Few who entered Mion ever returned. It was a city long forsaken, a corpse of Bretonnia's past, where the dead still walked, where the Lady of the Lake had turned her gaze away, and where honor had rotted into legend. Julien had known of it since childhood, whispered stories of its decay and ruin, a place where kings had failed and knights had fallen to despair. Now, it was more than just a ruined city. It was a throne waiting for its king. The black coach had come here for a reason. Valerius was preparing for something, and Julien had to stop him before it was too late. A city that should not breathe. The first sign of Mion's curse was the mist. It slithered across the streets like living things, thick as pale hands clawing at the ground, carrying whispers that did not belong to the wind. The second sign was the shadows. They did not move as they should. They stretched long in directions where there was no light, writhing like half-formed specters waiting for their bodies to return. The third sign was the dead. Not zombies, not ghouls, not the rotting cadavers Julien had seen rise in Sylvania's haunted ruins. These dead did not move. These dead did not rot. They stood, figures in tattered clothing, nobles forever caught mid-bow, servants locked in the act of pouring empty goblets, children motionless in the streets, frozen as if playing a game they had long forgotten. They were not alive. They were not corpses. They were memories given shape, the echoes of the damned. Mion was a city that remembered, and now it was waiting. The coronation of a forgotten king. Julien guided Beaufort through the ruined streets, his blade ready, his jaw clenched. He had chased the black coach across Stirland and Sylvania, across graveyards and haunted roads. But here, he felt the end. Something had shifted. He could feel it in his bones. And then he saw them. The Wraith Knights of Valerius. Knights of the Forgotten Prince. They stood like statues in the center of the city, gathered upon the broken steps of a ruined palace where once Bretonnian kings had ruled. Now it was their domain, a court of the dead, a kingdom waiting for its king. Julien reined Beaufort to a halt, watching from the shadows of a collapsed cathedral. His breath was slow, steady, his heart beat a thunder beneath his armor. There were dozens of them, knights in blackened plate, their armor corroded but unbroken, their sigils long faded, their shields marked with the heraldry of houses that no longer existed. Bretonnians, knights who had once ridden under the banner of honor. Now they were Valerius' honor guard. At the top of the broken palace steps, upon a throne of bones and rusted steel, sat an empty suit of armor, a crown resting upon its helm. Waiting. And then the whispers became voices. The voice of the prince. Julien de Calmont. His breath caught. Valerius was here. The air shuddered, the mist twisting, thickening, swirling toward the throne. And then the black coach arrived. It rolled into the ruined courtyard without sound, the air around it burning with cold, the Wraith Knights bowing as it came to a stop. The door creaked open, and a shadow stepped forth. Valerius Von Carstein. His form was not fully flesh, not yet. He was half wraith, half man, his face shifting between memory and darkness, his red eyes burning with unnatural hunger. The knights dropped to one knee. The echoes of the dead city whispered his name. Julien gritted his teeth, gripping his sword. This was it. This was what he had chased across the cursed roads of the world. And he was alone, a choice at the end of the road. Valerius watched him, his head tilting, his form flickering between shadow and regal nobility. And then he spoke. Why do you still fight, Julien? The voice was not mocking. It was not cruel. It was patient. Britannia has forsaken you. Your gods are silent. Your wounds fester. You are dying. Julien stepped forward, sword raised. I am not dead yet. A soft chuckle. No, but you will be. Valerius spread his arms, gesturing to the ruined city. Do you not see? This is not a battle, Julien. This is a coronation. The dead were gathering. The knights of old were kneeling. The city was preparing to hail its king. Valerius descended the steps, his boots making no sound upon the stone. You are a warrior of the past, Julien. You chase honor that no longer exists. Britannia is a dying kingdom, rotting beneath its own arrogance. The whispers of Mion grew louder. Kneel. Julien staggered, his wounds burning, his soul heavy with exhaustion. Swear fealty, and you will never suffer again. The war will be over. The pain will end. The knights of the dead turned to him. The city waited for a choice. The final defiance. Julien felt his limbs tremble, the weight of his failures crashing down upon him. But then, he remembered the faces of the fallen. The villages lost. The innocents burned. The honor that he refused to let die. He lifted his sword and spat blood upon the ground. I will not kneel to a corpse. Valerius sighed, a long, patient sigh. Then you will die with them. The Wraith Knights unsheathed their swords. The dead city began to move. The coronation had begun, and Julien had one last battle to fight. Chapter 17. The Abbey of the Nameless. A city that will not let go. Julien fled Mouzon, his body battered, his wounds bleeding freely. He had fought off Valerius's Wraith Knights, carving his way through their spectral ranks, barely escaping the coronation of the forgotten prince. He had failed to stop it. The black coach still rode. Valerius was growing stronger. And now the cursed city of Mion whispered his name, calling him back. But he had learned one thing. There was one place left. One last chance to sever the forgotten prince from the world before his resurrection was complete. The Abbey of the Nameless. The forsaken monastery. The Abbey stood upon a hill of broken stone, its walls crumbling, its towers collapsing inward like a dying thing. It had once been a sanctuary, a place where Bretonnian monks had prayed, had offered mercy to the lost, the damned, and the forsaken. And it had been where Valerius had come to seek absolution. He had ridden to these gates centuries ago, his soul fractured, his mind tormented, after his transformation into something neither dead nor alive. But the monks had refused him. They had turned him away, casting him from their gates, calling him unclean, unnatural. And so, in his grief and rage, Valerius had slaughtered them all. Now, the Abbey of the Nameless was nothing but ruin, and its dead had never truly left. The dead monks speak. As Julien stepped into the ruins, his breath misted in the air, though there was no wind. The Abbey was silent, too silent. And then the shadows moved. Figures in tattered robes drifted from the darkness, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their bodies partially formed, flickering between memory and reality. The monks of the Abbey of the Nameless. Those who had denied Valerius peace. They did not attack. They watched. Knight of Britannia, you have come to do what we could not. Julien clenched his jaw, gripping his sword. I have come to end him. The monks stared at him, their faces featureless, hollow voids beneath their hoods. There is only one way to sever him from this world. A soul for a soul. Julien's heart clenched. He knew what they meant. To banish Valerius, he had to perform a ritual that would sever the final chain anchoring the forgotten prince to the mortal world. But such a rite would not be without cost. A soul had to be offered, and if there was no other, it would have to be his own, the forbidden rite. The monks gestured toward the ruined altar, a great slab of cracked stone, blackened with age and dried blood. A silver dagger lay upon it, untouched by time, its blade etched with runes of ancient power. To sever the forgotten prince, his name must be erased. His sorrow must be undone, and a soul must be given in exchange. Julien swallowed. If he performed the ritual, if he offered his own soul, he would be lost forever. There would be no afterlife, no return to the Lady of the Lake's grace, no salvation. But Valerius would be gone, and the black coach would ride no more. Julien's fingers trembled as he reached for the dagger. His entire life had led to this moment, to one final sacrifice, a choice in blood. He placed the dagger to his palm, ready to spill his own blood upon the altar, to give his soul to stop the forgotten prince once and for all. And then, laughed, a voice that did not belong to the monks. "Oh, Julien, do you think it would be that simple?" The abbey trembled. The air split apart, and the black coach arrived. The prince intervenes. It did not roll in the ruins. It materialized, a ripple of shadow and death, a pulse of ancient malice, as the black coach emerged within the monastery walls, its presence shattering the silence. Julien turned, blade in hand, as the door of the coach creaked open. And Valerius stepped forth. He was almost whole now, almost flesh again. His armor was no longer mist, but real steel, reforged by the suffering of the dead. His eyes gleamed red, no longer just wraith light, but something solid, something awake. And his voice was full, complete, regal. "Ah, my dear knight, how poetic, how tragic." He gestured toward the altar, the monks, the dagger. "You came all this way, only to die for a cause you do not even understand." Julien did not lower his sword. "I understand enough." Valerius smiled. "No, you do not." The Wraith Knight stepped from the mist. The monks turned, their spectral forms shifting in alarm, and the final battle for Valerius's soul began. The abbey burns. The Wraith Knights attacked. The monks fought back, their hands glowing with forgotten power. Julien lunged for Valerius. Steel clashed with shadow, the air filled with the wails of the dead, the cries of the damned. Julien's blade struck true, but Valerius did not bleed. He only laughed. "You think you can end me with steel, little knight? You still do not understand." Valerius raised his hand. Julien's wounds ignited with agony. The marks of the black coach, the sickness within him. It was not just a wound. It was a claim. Valerius grinned, stepping forward. "You have been riding with me longer than you think, Julien." Julien's knees buckled. The ritual was his only chance. But to finish it, he had to make the ultimate sacrifice. And in the burning ruins of the Abbey of the Nameless, Julien had only moments to decide. Chapter 18. The Hunt of the Spectral Hounds. A city that will not let him leave. Julien ran. His legs were leaden, his muscles burned, and every wound from his battles past screamed with the effort. The air was thick with rot and grave dust, the city of Mion wrapping around him like a tomb that refused to stay buried. Valerius had not let him die in the Abbey of the Nameless. No, he had let him run. And now the hunt was on. The sound of the hunt begins. Somewhere behind him, beyond the crumbling streets and collapsed mansions, beyond the echoing courtyards where ghostly nobility stood frozen in their eternal waltz, the first howl split the night. Low, hungry, endless. Julien gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to keep moving, his boots slipping against the slime-covered cobblestones, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then another howl. Closer this time. He could hear the clatter of claws on stone, the sound of something too fast, too heavy to be mortal. Valerius had loosed his hound, and they were coming. The first sight of the beasts. He turned a corner and nearly slipped into the stagnant water pooling in the sunken streets. The city had been slowly sinking for centuries, its ruins half consumed by the swampy floodwaters that had drowned its lower districts. A place of rot and decay, a place of death, and now a hunting ground. From the mist behind him, they emerged. The spectral hounds of Valerius. They were not wolves, nor mortal hounds. They were things carved from darkness itself. Their bodies were long and gaunt, their fur woven from shadow and mist, their ribs visible through stretched, sickly flesh. Their eyes burned cold white, and their mouths, oh, their mouths, rows of impossibly sharp fangs, far too many for a mortal beast, gleamed wet with the hunger of things that had never been truly alive. They moved without sound, despite their massive size, their bodies shifting like smoke caught in the wind. But when they ran, they were faster than any beast of flesh. And they were closing in. The chase through the ruins. Julien leapt across a collapsed balcony, his boots skidding upon the rotting wood, the damp stone of the decayed manse cracking under his weight. The hounds did not slow. One of them bounded forward, its jaws gaping unnaturally wide, snapping at his heels. Julien twisted mid-air, his sword flashing. Steel met shadow. The hound shrieked as his blade cleaved through its neck, but instead of flesh and bone there was only mist and wailing echoes. It did not die. It simply reformed. Julien hit the ground hard, rolling into a sprint before the creature could attack again. His mind raced. They were not real. They were not of the living. He could not kill them with steel. And yet they could tear the flesh from his bones. He needed to get out of the open. He needed to make his stand somewhere they could not surround him. Then he saw it. Ahead, past the rotting husks of abandoned homes, beyond the vine-covered statues of knights long forgotten, a crypt, sunken and half-flooded, its entrance barely visible beneath the tangled roots of an ancient dead tree, its iron gate hanging open like a maw. It was a terrible place to hide. But it was better than dying in the streets. The flooded crypt. Julien threw himself down the cracked stairway, mud and stagnant water sloshing beneath his boots as he stumbled into the darkness below. The crypt was small, narrow, its walls lined with ancient sarcophagi, their stone lids cracked, revealing the skeletal remains of long-dead lords. The air stank of mildew, damp stone, and the lingering rot of the drowned. It would have to do. He turned just in time to see the first hound descend after him. It did not hesitate. It did not slow. It lunged. Julien raised his sword, but the beast passed through him like mist, its cold tearing into his flesh like claws raking across his soul. Pain exploded through his chest. He staggered back, gasping, his vision swimming. The hound reformed, prowling toward him, its burning white eyes locking onto his own. The others were coming. He had to act now. A desperate stand. Julien steeled himself, focusing through the pain, through the unnatural cold seeping into his bones. He could not kill them with steel. But perhaps the dead feared their own. His eyes darted toward the broken tombs, the skeletal remains of the forgotten nobility. The dead did not rest here. This place was still haunted by its own past. He moved before he could hesitate, kicking over one of the sarcophagi, scattering bones into the water. The hounds shrieked. They recoiled. They feared the dead. It was not enough to banish them, but it was enough to slow them. Julien gritted his teeth and made his move. He reached for the remains, and he spoke the words of the dead, calling upon the nameless. He did not know the language, He did not know the meaning, but the words came. A chant, an invocation, not of the Lady of the Lake, not of the gods of Britonia, but of something older, something still bound to this place. The bones in his hands trembled. The crypt itself groaned, and the spirits of the forgotten knights awoke. The wraith-hounds howled, recoiling as spectral figures rose from their tombs, their eyes hollow, their bodies wrapped in the tattered remains of their burial shrouds. They had been knights once. Now they were something else. The spectral figures turned toward Julien, and for a brief, horrible moment, he thought they might attack him instead. Then they lunged at the hounds. The crypt erupted into chaos, the shrieks of the hounds meeting the wails of the forgotten dead, their forms clashing in a battle that had no flesh, no steel, only suffering. Julien did not wait to see who won. He turned and ran, forcing himself up the slick stone steps, his legs weak, his body aching. The moment he reached the surface, the mist closed in, sealing the crypt behind him. The hunt had ended. For now, he could still hear the screams of the battle below, but he did not stop. The black coach still rode, and he had to stop it before it was too late. Chapter 19. The Black Wedding. A city awaits its king. The ruins of Mion trembled with anticipation. A city of the forgotten, where nobility long drowned in filth still walked in ghostly silence, where the echoes of a cursed dynasty never faded. Tonight they gathered. Not the living, nor the truly dead, but those caught between. Spirits, wraiths, noble lords draped in spectral finery, their flesh rotted beneath jeweled gowns and rusted crowns. The once great cathedral of Mion, now broken and blackened by time, had been reawakened. Its shattered stained glass bled moonlight, casting eerie colors upon the decayed pews. The ruined altar, once a place of holy vows, had been defiled, turned into a throne of bone and ruin. A wedding was about to begin. The bride awaited, and Valerius would rise, unless Julien could stop it. The possessed bride. Julien moved quickly, his boots slick with damp rot as he climbed the crumbling stone steps toward the cathedral doors. He was too late to stop the gathering, but the ceremony had not yet begun. Inside, a woman in black stood before the throne, her gown a silken shroud, her veil woven of shadows. The noble woman was not herself. She was a vessel. Her eyes were wrong, glowing with an eerie red fire, her movements slow, unnatural, as if guided by a hand unseen. Valeria's spirit was already within her, and before her, waiting beneath the cathedral's crumbling archway, stood his knights. The Wraith Lords, the last remnants of Valerius's ancient court. They stood in deathless silence, their skeletal hands clutching rusted swords, their empty sockets glowing with the cold light of the grave. And beyond them, at the altar of decay, lay the final piece of the ritual. A coffin, not a ruined one, nor a relic of ages past, but a new one, prepared for the return of its king. The wedding begins. A deep voice filled the chamber, its sound carrying across the ruined pews, the gathered dead, the waiting shadows. Valerius, my bride awaits me. The noblewoman's lips parted, but it was not her voice that answered. It was his. And I await you, my love. The dead watched in reverence, their hollow gazes unblinking, their silent hunger filling the air like a fog of decay. If the ceremony was completed, if the possessed noblewoman was wed in death, Valerius would be whole again. His soul would take her body, and the world would kneel before him once more. Julien did not hesitate. He would not let it happen. The night strikes. Julien burst through the grand doors, his sword flashing in the candlelight, his armor coated in the grime of his long journey. The dead turned to him, but they did not move. They knew he would come. They had been waiting. The noblewoman lifted her gaze, the red light within her eyes burning brighter. Valerius laughed through her lips. "Ah, Julia, you never fail to disappoint." The Wraith Knights raised their weapons. The dead began to close in. But Julien had not come to fight an army. He had come to stop a wedding. He charged forward, knocking aside a shambling noble wraith, dodging a rusted halberd swung by a skeletal knight, his eyes locked upon the bride at the altar. If he could sever Valerius' connection to her, the ritual would collapse. But to do that, he had to kill her. A terrible choice. The noblewoman stared at him, her face half her own, half Valerius', flickering like a candle caught between two flames. For a moment, she was herself. Her eyes widened in terror. "Please help me." Then Valerius returned, and she smiled. "Will you strike down an innocent woman, knight? Or will you let your honor be your undoing?" Julien hesitated. A moment too long. The coffin behind her trembled, its lid slowly shifting, pushed by unseen hands. Valerius was rising. If he did not act now, it would be too late. The final blow. Julien gritted his teeth. There was no other way. With a roar, he swung his sword in a downward arc, aiming for the noblewoman's heart, only for her to move faster than any mortal could. Her veil snapped aside, her hands catching the blade, the flesh of her palms burning as she held it mid-swing. Valerius had no intention of letting him win. Not yet, knight. The room shook. The coffin lid flew open, and Valerius began to rise. The wedding is broken. Julien acted on instinct. His free hand shot forward, grasping the silver dagger given to him in the Abbey of the Nameless, and he drove it into the bride's heart. Her scream split the air, but it was not her voice. It was Valerius. The coffin trembled violently, the shadows recoiling, the dead wailing in agony. The noblewoman's body convulsed, her hands clawing at her chest, her veins blackening with unnatural corruption. And then, the connection shattered. Valerius's half-formed body collapsed back into the coffin, his essence ripped away from the bride before it could take hold. The dead shrieked, their forms crumbling into dust, their long-forgotten souls cast back into the abyss. The Wraith Knights fell, their weapons clattering to the floor, their bodies folding inward like collapsing shadows. The Black Wedding had been broken, but it was not over. The cathedral began to collapse, the very foundation of the ritual unraveling, the last remnants of Valerius's binding to this place shattering. Julien staggered back, his breath heavy, his sword coated in spectral ichor. The noblewoman lay dead before him, her face, finally, at peace. But from the coffin, beneath the swirling mist of magic that had been ripped apart, a voice still whispered, "You cannot stop me. Forever." Julien turned and ran. A hollow victory. The cathedral collapsed behind him, the weight of its cursed history sinking into the grave. Julien mounted Beaufort, spurring the horse into a gallop, not daring to look back. Valerius was still out there. His resurrection had been delayed, but not undone. And somewhere, beyond the mist-choked ruins of Mausoleum, the black coach was already moving once more. The hunt was not over. Not yet. Chapter 20. The Coronation of the Forgotten Prince. A storm over Drakenhof. The winds howled through the corpse of a castle, screaming through cracked battlements, rattling the iron gates of Drakenhof like the whispers of the long dead. The black coach had arrived. It stood motionless in the ruined courtyard, its horses frozen mid-step, their fleshless skulls steaming with cold mist. The ground beneath it was scorched black, the very stone cracking apart from the weight of something far older than time itself. A final gathering of the dead was taking place. Wraiths lined the broken towers, spectral banners fluttering in an unnatural wind, their colors long faded, their sigils unrecognizable, relics of a forgotten age. And at the center of the courtyard, beneath the collapsed remnants of Drakenhof's throne room, the ritual had begun. Valerius would rise. The ruined gates. Julien rode hard, his steed panting beneath him, hooves clashing against the cracked stone of the old roads leading to Drakenhof Keep. The storm above raged, the sky a churning mass of black and red, flashes of sickly green lightning illuminating the ruins in fractured, nightmarish bursts. He was too late, but he would not stop. The gates of Drakenhof stood before him, twisted and broken, their iron bent inward like grasping hands, and from the darkness beyond, figures emerged. The last of Valerius' knights, the final guardians of the forgotten prince. Their armor was rusted, yet their blades gleamed like newly forged steel, their bodies little more than skeletal husks draped in the finery of old nobility. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their purpose was etched into their very existence. They would not let him pass. The last charge. Julien drew his sword, his breath heavy, his body screaming from wounds unhealed, from battles fought against things no man should have survived. But he had no time to hesitate. He would not let another kingdom fall. He would not let another monster wear the crown. For Britannia, he spurred Beaufort forward and the charge began. The Wraith Knights moved as one. Their shields locked, their spears lowering, an unholy cavalry prepared to meet him in death. Julien angled his blade, muscles coiling for the inevitable clash. The first knight thrust forward, a lance of pure shadow seeking his heart. Julien twisted at the last second, his sword flashing. Steel met cursed iron. The knight shattered upon impact, its bones cracking into dust, its soul ripped from its armor in a violent wail. But there were too many. The next one struck. A spear scraped across his shoulder, cutting deep, his blood splattering across the ruins. Another knight lunged, its blade coming for his throat. Julien ducked, bringing his sword up in a brutal counterstrike, the edge biting deep into cursed plate, splitting the spectre in half. But they did not stop. They would never stop. And beyond them, upon the ruined throne of Drakenhof, Valerius stood, the awakening of the forgotten prince. He was whole, no longer mist, no longer shadow. He stood as he once had, clad in dark plate, his crimson cape flowing in the wind, a golden crown resting upon his head like a terrible weight. His eyes burned red, no longer just the glow of undeath, but the hunger of something far worse. And in his hands, a sword of black fire. Valerius watched the battle below, his expression calm, patient. "You fought well, Julien." His voice was no longer an echo. It was real, it was powerful, it was kingly. Julien cut down another knight, his body screaming in protest, his limbs barely holding him upright. He could not stop now. He forced his way through the last of the wraiths, sprinting toward the throne, his blade raised for the final strike. But Valerius moved faster. In an instant he was upon him, his blackened sword slamming against Julien's own, the force nearly sending the knight to his knees. He was too strong. This was no longer a broken shade. This was a king returned. Valerius pushed forward, his strength inhuman, unstoppable, unnatural. Julien's sword cracked. His arms buckled, his vision blurred. He had failed. The coronation is complete. Julien staggered, his sword falling from his grasp, the pain in his chest unbearable. Valerius stood over him, the black fire of his blade reflecting upon the wet stone, his expression unreadable. "It is done." The dead gathered around the throne, their whispers rising in unholy reverence. The forgotten prince was no longer forgotten. He was king once more. Valerius lifted his sword, the killing blow prepared. Julien closed his eyes, bracing for the end. And then a horn sounded in the distance. The hunt is not over. Valerius' blade halted, his eyes narrowing as the sound echoed through the ruins of Drachenhof. It was not the call of the dead. It was not a sound from Sylvania. It was a Bretonnian war horn. Valerius' lips curled into something resembling a smile. They finally come. Julien's allies had found him. He was not alone. The hunt was not over. But now, Julien was no longer the hunter. Valerius had won, and the knight had become the hunted. To be continued. Chapter 21. The Gathering of the Dead. The moment of ascension, Julien could not move. His body was broken, his wounds deep, his armor cracked, his sword shattered at his side. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of something beyond death itself. Valerius had won. The ritual was complete, the black coach's long journey ending in the ruins of Drachenhof Keep, where Sylvania's past and future collided in an unholy coronation. And now, in the twisted light of an unnatural dawn, the forgotten prince stood reborn. A king once more. Valerius was whole. Not mist, not shadow, not a whisper in the dark. He was flesh again. His form was regal, his armor gleaming in the cursed light, its black steel wrought with the sigils of an empire long erased. The golden filigree of his breastplate was lined with runes older than the empire itself, glowing with the echoes of necromantic power. A long tattered cloak of deep crimson billowed behind him, the edges frayed, yet untouched by time. But his face was the worst of all. He was beautiful, and he was terrible. Where once he had been a noble of Sylvania, now his features were carved in the perfection of undeath. His skin was pale, smooth as polished ivory, his cheekbones sharp, his eyes burning like dying stars. And his smile was not cruel, not mocking. It was the smile of a king welcoming his kingdom. And his kingdom had come. The dead nail. A rumbling shook the ruins of Drachenhof. Not thunder, not the collapse of the ruined castle, but the footsteps of an army. From the shadows, from the depths of forgotten crypts, from the drowned ruins of ancient catacombs, they came. The dead? All of them. Thousands, tens of thousands. An army that had never been laid to rest. A legion of warriors who had been waiting for this moment for centuries. Their armor was rusted, their weapons corroded, yet they stood as they had in life, their heads bowed, their eyes hollow, their bones bound by the will of their prince. They knelt before him. A sea of skeletons, wraiths and ghouls, stretching beyond the ruined gates of Drachenhof. And above them, lining the crumbling battlements, stood the wraith lords of ages past. Once they had been kings. Now they were his servants. A throne of bone. Valerius stepped forward. He moved with grace, each step measured, controlled, his presence undeniable, unshakable. He was not merely a lord of undeath. He was royalty. He climbed the broken steps of the throne, standing before the ruined seat of Drachenhof, its marble long stained with the blood of centuries. Julien, still half-conscious, could do nothing but watch. The weight of failure pressed upon him. He had fought so hard, and he had lost. Valerius raised his hand, his gauntlet glistening with spectral energy, and the air around them turned to ice. The dead stilled. The very earth seemed to hold its breath. And then Valerius spoke. The proclamation of the forgotten prince. His voice was not shouted, not filled with rage or vengeance. It was calm, absolute, final. For centuries, I was cast aside, forgotten, betrayed by my own kin, buried in the dust of history. His burning gaze swept across his kneeling army, his wraith knights, his legions of the dead. But no longer. His fingers curled into a fist, and a pulse of necromantic power shook the ruins. The dead shuddered. Their bones cracked and reformed. Their eyes burned with new light. I am Valerius Von Carstein, the last true heir of Sylvania, the king that was lost, but not undone. He turned his gaze toward Julien, and smiled. And I have returned. The knight's helplessness. Julien gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his knees, his fingers gripping the shattered remains of his sword. No, this could not be the end. He had not come this far just to watch the world fall. But his body was weak. His vision swam. And the truth was undeniable. Valerius had won. The black coach had completed its journey. The ritual had succeeded. The forgotten prince had claimed his throne. Julien had lost. The final words. Valerius descended from the throne, his steps measured, unhurried, until he stood mere feet from the kneeling knight. The dead did not move. They did not need to. Their king had no fear of a broken man, and neither did Julien. With the last of his strength, Julien raised his shattered blade, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. He was too weak to strike, but he would not kneel. Not to him. Valerius tilted his head, amusement flickering behind his crimson gaze. Still defiant even now. Julien glared at him. "Kill me." Valerius chuckled. "No, Julien. Not yet." He leaned closer, his breath cold as the grave, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are more valuable to me alive." The knight stiffened. "What?" Valerius stepped back, turning to his army, his voice carrying across the dead. "We march. Britannia has forgotten its sins, and now it will remember." The dead roared in unison. The ground trembled. Drakenhof Keep shook beneath the might of its reborn master. Julien could only watch as the army of the forgotten prince rose and prepared to march. This was no longer a battle. It was war, and it had only just begun. Chapter 22. The Knight's Last Stand. The dead began to march. The ruins of Drakenhof Keep trembled, the weight of an army that should not exist pressing upon the earth. The forgotten prince had returned, and his legions were rising. Julien forced himself to stand, his bones aching, his vision blurred, his body half broken from the battles before. But he was not dead yet. And while he lived, he would fight. Ahead, Valerius von Carstein stood upon the broken steps of his throne, his cursed banners unfurling, the dead gathering in disciplined, silent ranks before him. And before Julien could take even one step forward, a knight stepped into his path, the champion of the forgotten prince. A towering figure in blackened armor, its surface corroded, battle-worn yet undeniably regal. It had been a knight once, and now it was something else. The helm was featureless, its visor revealing nothing but shadow, yet the presence within it was undeniable, a force of sheer will and purpose, bound to one task alone: to stop Julien. It carried a great sword of ruin, a weapon so large it should have been impossible to wield, yet it held it with unnatural ease, the blade humming with a low, deathly whisper. "You will not pass." The voice was deep, hollow, ancient. The knight raised its sword, pointing it toward Julien in a silent challenge. The meaning was clear. To reach Valerius, he would have to go through this monster. There was no other way. A duel between light and darkness. Julien tightened his grip on the remains of his sword. The blade was cracked, chipped from the countless battles, but still it gleamed with defiance. He had nothing left to give. Nothing but his life. The Black Knight moved first, faster than a corpse should move, faster than a man should react. The great sword came down in a single monstrous arc, aiming to cleave Julien in half. Julien barely moved in time. Steel met stone. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, splitting the very ground beneath them. Julien rolled away, his lungs burning, his mind screaming warnings he could not afford to listen to. He had to end this quickly. He could not match this thing in strength. He had to outthink it. The fight turns desperate. Julien lunged, his blade slicing low, aiming for the Black Knight's exposed leg joints. The knight did not flinch. It did not step back. It let the blow land. And it did nothing. Julien's blade bit deep into the armor, but there was no blood, no reaction, nothing but the cold, eternal force that drove the knight forward. A corpse does not feel pain. A corpse does not hesitate. The Black Knight struck again, a brutal horizontal sweep that would have taken Julien's head from his shoulders. Julien dropped low, ducking just in time, feeling the wind of the blade tear past his hair. Too close. Far too close. The knight's desperation. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs weak, his sword arms screaming from exertion. But still, he fought. Because if he fell here, there would be no one left to fight. If he fell, Valerius would rule. And the world would drown in undeath. Julien pivoted, using speed instead of strength, twisting away from the next strike, bringing his sword up in a desperate thrust aimed for the knight's throat. The blade connected, and still the Black Knight did not fall. It was like fighting the grave itself. A fatal mistake. Julien had spent too long fighting the dead, and he had forgotten. They did not tire, but he did. The Black Knight's gauntleted fist shot out, striking Julien across the jaw. The world spun. His vision flashed white. He hit the ground hard. The knight loomed over him, its massive sword rising one final time, aimed for his heart. This was it. This was how it ended. And then a war horn sounded. Reinforcements arrive. The air split with the sound of charging hooves, the clatter of steel, the cries of men still alive. Britannia had come? From the ruins beyond, knights in shining armor burst forth, banners raised high, their lances lowered, their cries filling the cursed air. The Black Knight turned, distracted for the first time. Julien did not waste the moment. With a scream of effort, he thrust upward, driving the broken remains of his sword through the Black Knight's chest. The armor shattered. The knight collapsed, and Julien lived. But there was no time for relief. Valerius stood upon the ruins of his throne, his gaze calm, patient. Even as the Bretonnian knights clashed with the undead, even as battle erupted across Drakenhof, he did not move. He watched. And then he smiled. We begin in earnest, then. The war had truly begun, and the forgotten prince was waiting. Chapter 23. The Black Coach's Price. The Battlefield of the Dead. The ruins of Drakenhof Keep were ablaze, not with fire, but with the clash of steel against bone, the wailing of wraiths, and the war cries of the living fighting against an army that did not know pain, did not fear death, and did not yield. Britannia had come, but so had the dead. Julien staggered to his feet, his body battered, bloodied, the taste of iron thick in his mouth. His vision blurred, but he could still see the shapes of the battle unfolding around him. Knights of the Grail clashed with the Wraith Knights of Valerius. Men-at-arms fought desperately against the tide of the restless dead. The air was thick with necromantic power, the very land itself crying out in agony. But none of it mattered, not yet, because at the heart of it all, beyond the broken throne, beyond the fallen gates, the black coach still stood. Its wheels dripped with shadows, its horses pawed at the ground, their skeletal bodies wreathed in ghostly mist. The final ritual was underway. Valerius was still rising, and Julien had one last chance to stop him. The final anchor, Through the madness of battle, Julien forced himself forward, pushing past shambling corpses, dodging the arcing swings of wraith blades, his body screaming with every movement. He had to reach the black coach. The last anchor was within it. The coffin. The prison of Valerius' fractured soul. If he could destroy it, he could still undo the ritual. He could still sever the forgotten prince's connection to the mortal world. But as he neared, the black coach moved. It did not need a driver. It was alive. It turned toward him like a beast sensing its prey, the wheels grinding against broken stone, the very air warping around it, as if the thing were not truly bound by the laws of this world. And then it charged. A race against death. Julien barely had time to react. The black coach surged toward him, a streak of black lightning, a nightmare given shape. He leapt aside, too slow. The edge of the coach clipped him, sending him sprawling across the shattered ground, his body slamming against a pile of broken stone. Pain exploded through him, his vision spinning, his lungs fighting for breath. But he could not stop. He rolled to his feet just as the coach wheeled back around, its charge relentless, its hunger insatiable. This was no mere carriage. This was a living thing, a predator born from the grave, and it was coming for him. The last blow. There was only one way. No more running. Julien stood his ground, planting his feet firmly, raising what was left of his sword. The black coach bore down upon him, its horses screaming like banshees, its wheels leaving burning trails of shadow in their wake. It would not stop, so he would stop it. Julien let out a roar, putting everything he had left into one final strike, his sword flashing in the cursed light. Steel met coffin. The blade pierced the black coach's heart. The world screamed. The coach buckled, shuddering violently, its structure cracking, splintering, black mist pouring from its seams. The skeletal horses reared, dissolving into wailing shadows. The wheels shattered upon impact, and the entire thing collapsed in upon itself. Julien had destroyed it. The last anchor was broken. The ritual should have failed, but it didn't. The price of victory. For a moment the battlefield fell silent. The dead paused, their movements uncertain, as if their very will had been undone. Julien staggered, his breath ragged, his legs barely holding him upright. Had he won? Had he stopped it in time? And then, from the rubble of the black coach, from the shattered coffin, something moved. The mist coiled, thickened, folding in on itself, reshaping. No. A figure stepped forth, a silhouette of ruin and rebirth. And Julien knew, in that moment, that he had failed. Valerius was reborn. The prince returns. The mist burned away, revealing a man standing where the black coat had been. A king where a corpse had lain. Valerius Von Carstein stood before them all, whole, real, and more powerful than ever. His armor gleamed, reforged in the crucible of death itself. His crimson cloak billowed, no longer the tattered remains of a forgotten age, but the regalia of an emperor of the damned. His sword, once shadow, was now steel, black and terrible, its edge pulsing with raw necromantic power. And his eyes were no longer the cold glow of a wraith. They burned with life. He was no longer a ghost. He was no longer a memory. He had returned. A moment of silence. The battlefield froze, as if the very world understood what had happened. The dead, once mindless, now stood taller, their bodies no longer puppets, but soldiers awaiting orders. The Wraith Knights knelt before their prince, their loyalty unquestioning. Even the Bretonnian knights faltered, the weight of pure, undeniable horror settling upon them. Valerius breathed deep, as if savoring the air, savoring his victory. And then he spoke. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was the voice of a king. "I told you, Julien." Julien barely had the strength to look up. "You cannot stop me." Valerius raised his sword, and the legions of the dead rose with him. The Bretonnian charge faltered, the knights now outnumbered, overwhelmed, facing something they could never have prepared for. And the hunt began anew. Julien could do nothing but watch as Valerius Von Carstein, the forgotten prince, the last heir of Sylvania, claimed his kingdom once more. Chapter 24. The Resurrection. The end of the Black Coach. The ruins of Drakenhof keep shuttered, the very foundations of the cursed land quaking beneath an ancient power reborn. The Black Coach, once the vessel of Valerius's fractured soul, no longer stood. It had fulfilled its purpose. Its skeletal horses had long since crumbled into dust, their screams lost to the wind, their service complete. The twisted wood of the carriage splintered, its iron reinforcements rusting in an instant, as if centuries of time had caught up with it all at once. And then it was gone. The Black Coach disintegrated, collapsing into a swirling vortex of shadow and dust, its remnants sucked into the abyss from which it had come. It was no longer needed, for its master had returned. The birth of a new nightmare. From the ashen remains of the Black Coach, something shifted. Something stood. A figure. Not a corpse, not a wraith, not the half-formed spectre that had haunted the roads of Sylvania. Valerius von Carstein was whole again. He stepped forward, his boots pressing against the cracked stone of Drakenhof, his movements smooth, effortless, powerful. No longer the flickering shadow of a prince lost to time. He had become something more. His armor, once a relic of the past, was now a masterpiece of undeath. Black steel edged in silver, woven with arcane sigils that pulsed with necromantic power. His cloak, no longer tattered, flowed like living blood, catching the sickly wind, untouched by the decay around him. But it was his face that was the most terrifying of all, because it was human, and yet not. His skin was pale, unblemished, neither rotting nor monstrous, but eerily perfect, a noble prince reborn, yet with the eyes of a god of death. His crimson gaze burned, no longer a mere glow of undeath, but something more profound, a will forged in centuries of suffering, now unchained. And in his right hand, grasped with ease, was a sword unlike any mortal blade, a weapon reforged in the grave. A long, cruel thing of blackened silver, pulsing with the dying echoes of the souls bound to him, its edge shimmering with raw, unfiltered necromantic energy. Valerius took a deep breath, savoring the air, the sensation of life returning to his immortal form. And then he smiled. The silence of the battlefield. The moment of his resurrection stretched across the battlefield, an unnatural stillness falling over the warring forces. The dead knew. They felt it. The wraiths stood motionless, their heads tilting upward, as if acknowledging a force greater than themselves. The skeletons, the revenants, the ghoul hordes, all of them halted, their restless souls no longer driven by fragmented will, but by a master now fully present. Valerius had no need to command them. They already knew who ruled them. And the living? The Bretonnian knights felt it too. Where once they had fought an undead horde, now they faced something worse, an empire with a king. Even the boldest of them hesitated, the weight of Valerius's presence pressing down upon them like the hand of a god made flesh. This was no longer a battle. This was the birth of a wren, Julien's despair. Among the wreckage of the battlefield, kneeling amidst the shattered ruins of his failures, Julien de Calmont could do nothing but watch. He had given everything, and still he had lost. His hands trembled, blood dripping from his fingers, his vision blurred with exhaustion, yet he could still see the terrible majesty of the reborn prince. His greatest enemy, no longer a shade, no longer a thing of half-existence, but a king returned. And there was nothing he could do to stop him now. The battle was still raging, but Julien knew the truth. It was over. Not because they had lost a fight, but because their enemy had become something beyond them. The forgotten prince was forgotten no more. The first decree. Valerius raised his blade, his voice carrying across the ruined battlefield, across the silence of the dead, across the uncertainty of the living. A voice of absolute command. No more shall Sylvania be a grave. The dead shuddered, their bones trembling, their souls bound to his will, tightening like chains drawn taut. No more shall we linger in the shadows, bound by the mistakes of the past. His burning gaze swept over the kneeling undead, the wraith lords, the ghouls hunched in reverence, the thousands upon thousands of warriors that had served for centuries without a master. We march, not as a horde, not as a curse, not as a remnant, but as a kingdom. The dead roared in answer. Drakenhof shook with the force of their cry. The world trembled. The final glance. Valerius turned, his gaze settling on Julien. The knight held his breath, every instinct in his body telling him to fight, to run, to do anything. But Valerius did not strike him down. No, he did something worse. He smiled. You fought well, knight, but war is not won in a single battle. He turned away, walking toward his throne, his black cloak flowing behind him, his legions awaiting his command. And then his final words rang out, cold as the grave, absolute as destiny. We are not done, Julien. Not yet. The beginning of the end. As Julien watched the army of the dead prepare to march, as the Bretonnian forces wavered, as the new king took his throne, he understood. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The forgotten prince had returned, and all the world would remember his name. Valerius von Carstein had won, and now his kingdom would rise. Chapter 25. The Last Oath. A Kingdom of the Dead. Julien knelt in the ruins of Drakenhof, his body broken, his sword shattered, his faith hanging by a thread as thin as a spider's web. The battle was lost. The forgotten prince had risen, and now before him the dead stood in silent ranks, not mindless, not wavering, but an army with a purpose, bound by the will of a king restored. They did not moan or groan, they did not shuffle like mindless ghouls. They stood like warriors, because they were warriors. And Valerius stood above them all, upon the broken steps of his ruined throne, his cursed blade resting at his side, his crimson cloak billowing in the cold, unnatural wind. His red eyes burned like twin dying stars. He had no need to gloat. He had already won. The silence before the storm. The battlefield was quiet now. Not because the war had ended, but because something worse had begun. The living had fallen back, regrouping, their leaders realizing too late that they had not merely been fighting an undead horde. They had been fighting the first step of a new empire. The Bretonnian knights stood in uneasy formations, their lances lowered but their hands trembling. They had seen the tide of war shift before, but never like this. Never against something they could not stop. And in the center of it all, Julien stared up at the monster he had failed to slay. His enemy, his nemesis, the king of the damned. A night's rage. Pain burned through every fiber of his being, his body a wreck of wounds, exhaustion, and failure. But he did not lower his head. He did not kneel. Instead, he forced himself to his feet, his breath ragged, his hands clenched into fists. His sword was gone, his armor dented and soaked in blood, but his will was not broken. Not yet. Not ever. This is not over. His voice was hoarse, raw with fury and loss, but it carried across the silent battlefield. Valerius raised an eyebrow, his head tilting slightly in amusement. Isn't it? Julien took a step forward, and another. until he stood barely a few paces from the undead prince, his hazel eyes burning with defiance, with hatred, with something unbreakable. No, it isn't. The vow in blood. Julien did not care that he was outmatched. He did not care that he had lost. Because this was not about winning. This was about never stopping. You stole this victory, Von Carstein. You clawed your way from the grave, but you will not hold your throne forever. The dead around them stirred, their bones whispering against the wind, their hollow sockets watching. But Julien did not fear them. He was beyond fear now. I will hunt you, to the ends of the earth, to the depths of the darkest crypts, across every battlefield and every cursed ruin. I will not stop. His breathing was ragged. His hands trembled from exhaustion. But his words were unwavering. I swear this upon my honor, upon my blood, upon the lady herself. I will kill you. The king's amusement. Valerius watched him, silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, not mockingly, not in scorn, but in genuine amusement. I expected you to flee, knight, to return to your lords, whispering of the horrors you have seen. He stepped closer, the ground cracking beneath his boots, the air thick with his presence. But this is far more interesting. Julien did not move. He did not back down. Valerius studied him as if seeing him for the first time, not as an enemy to be slain, but as something else. Something worthy. Then let it be so, Julien de Calmont. His voice was low, regal, amused yet utterly serious. You may chase me through the ages, across the graveyards of empires, through the ruins of kingdoms yet to fall. You may stand against me blade in hand, time and time again. His smile was terrible, and I will enjoy every moment of it. To reach his hand, and with a single motion, the undead army began to move. Not toward Julien, but away, marching from Drachenhof out into the world, not as a mindless horde, but as an army, a kingdom of the damned, marching beneath the banner of their forgotten king. The war begins. Julien watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the horror of what had begun. This was not just another battle lost. This was war. A war that would stretch across lifetimes, across generations, across the graves of those yet to be buried. But he did not let despair take him. He had made his vow, and he would keep it. Valerius Von Carstein had won this day, but he would not win forever. Julien watched the dead march from Drachenhof, the distant horizon swallowed by their numbers, and swore one last time, "Wherever you go, I will find you. Wherever you rise, I will strike you down." He turned, gripping the broken remains of his sword, and whispered, "This is not over, Valerius. Not yet. The eternal hunt begins." Epilogue. The beginning of a nightmare. A world left in ashes. Julien lay in the ruins of Drachenhof, his breath ragged, his body screaming with every shattered bone and torn muscle. The battle had ended, but the war had only begun. The army of the dead had marched from the ruins, disappearing into the mist-choked roads of Sylvania, their banners of black and crimson fluttering like shadows against the sickly moonlight. The forgotten prince had claimed his throne, and now he had vanished into the night. Valerius was no longer a whisper in the dark. He was real, he was flesh, he was power, and Julien had failed to stop him. A knight left to die. Pain lanced through his ribs as he tried to move, his vision swimming, the world around him a blur of blood and ruin. Somewhere, beyond the wreckage of the battlefield, the last remnants of the Bretonnian forces had begun their retreat. They had come to fight an undead horde. They had found something far worse. Many had died screaming, their bodies claimed by the dead, their souls bound to a kingdom that had no need for mercy. Julien was one of the few who still breathed, but for how much longer he did not know. He could still feel it, the lingering sickness, the curse that had brushed against his soul, the mark of the black coach still seared into his flesh. Valerius had let him live, not out of mercy, but out of amusement. The prince departs. Somewhere beyond the wreckage of Drachenhof, beyond the shattered gates, Julien could still feel his presence. Valerius was still there, watching, waiting. The horizon was empty, but Julien knew. The forgotten prince was already moving. His work had only just begun. Even now he could imagine him, walking through the ruined roads of Sylvania, vanishing into the fog, his black cloak swirling behind him, his eyes glowing like distant embers in the dark. Where was he going? What horrors would he awaken next? Julien did not know, and that terrified him. The price of survival. His fingers tightened in the dirt, his breath uneven, his body shaking with pain and exhaustion. He had sworn an oath. He had promised to hunt Valerius to the ends of the earth. But now, in the quiet ruins of Drachenhof, surrounded by the stench of death, the echoes of the fallen, he wondered, was that even possible? How could he kill something that could not die? How could he fight something that had already won? And how much of himself would he lose before it was over? The wind howled through the ruins, a terrible, mocking wail. Or perhaps it was laughter. Perhaps Valerius was still watching, waiting for the hunt to begin. The hunt is not over. Julien forced himself to his feet. He could not stay here. He could not let this be the end. His wounds burned, his vision spun, but he took a step forward. Then another. One day he would find Valerius again. One day he would drive a blade through his heart. One day he would win. But not today. Today he would live. Today he would survive. And the next time they met, he would be ready. For the forgotten prince would not rule forever. And this hunt would never end. In the depths of the night, far from the ruins of Drachenhof, beyond the shattered remnants of the battlefield, beyond the reach of the living, Valerius von Carstein stood atop a lonely hill, his crimson gaze fixed upon the distant horizon. He breathed deeply, the sensation foreign, unnecessary, but pleasing. It had been so long since he had walked upon the world as more than a shadow. Behind him, his legions moved in silence, the first step of an empire reborn, the march of a kingdom forgotten no longer. He turned, glancing once more toward the west, toward the lands of the living, toward the kingdom of Bretonia. A slow, terrible smile curved his lips. This was only the beginning. The hunt had only just begun, and he had all eternity to enjoy it.